Hey there, and welcome back. The day is finally behind you, with all that it asked and all that it took, and there is nothing left for you to do now but set it down. So let your shoulders ease into the mattress, let the warmth gather around you, and let me carry you a long way off, 3 centuries and more, into the candlelit world of the 18th century and the life of one of the most remarkable women ever to wear a crown. Tonight, I want to tell you the story of a queen most people have never heard of, and yet who was, in her own quiet way, one of the cleverest and most powerful figures of her whole age, a woman who began life as a penniless orphan with nothing to her name, and ended it as the true ruling intelligence behind the throne of Great Britain. She was beautiful, and she was brilliant, learned in philosophy and theology, when princesses were taught only to dance, the friend of the greatest thinkers of her day, and she governed a kingdom through a husband she managed with such skill that he never quite understood he was being managed at all. This is a story for anyone who loves a tale of a sharp mind making its way in a world built to thwart it, of wit and ambition and a strange and enduring marriage, of a woman who held real power in an age that gave women almost none. So let your breathing slow and lengthen, and let the cares of the day drift off into the dark, for there is nothing here you need to carry, only a long and clever and very human life to travel gently alongside as sleep comes up to meet you. And before the night is over, we will watch a portionless orphan girl, with no fortune and no prospects, turn down the offer of one of the greatest thrones in all of Europe, and choose her conscience over a crown. Before her story begins in earnest, there is one small thing I would ask of you, and then I will not interrupt again. I am always quietly curious about who is keeping me company in the dark of these long nights, so if you would care to leave a word below saying where in the world you are listening from, and what hour it has reached where you are, I would love to look through them later. For there is a strange and gentle comfort in imagining all these scattered rooms, in all these far-off places, turned toward the same old story at the same late hour. And if the slow, unhurried telling of history is the kind of company you would like on the nights when sleep is slow in coming, you would be most welcome to subscribe, with no urgency about it at all, so that the next of these quiet evenings can find its way to you when it is ready. But there's the whole of it, and now the night belongs to her. Picture this: a small walled town in the heart of Germany, on a cold day at the very start of March, in the year 1683, its steep roofs white with frost, the smoke rising straight up from 1,000 chimneys into a pale and freezing sky. This is Ansbach, the seat of a margrave, one of the countless little princely capitals scattered across the patchwork of the old German lands, a modest place of no great consequence in the affairs of the world. And in the margrave's residence, in a curtained and firelit chamber, a daughter has been born to the ruling family, a baby girl who has arrived into the cold of that early spring with no particular fanfare, for she is only a younger child of a minor prince, and no one expects her to amount to a great deal. No one looking down into that cradle could have begun to guess at the extraordinary distance her life would travel from this frost-bound town to the very summit of one of the great kingdoms of the world, by way of more grief and more danger, and more sheer reversal of fortune than most lives could hold. Her name is Caroline, and she will one day be a queen. And the story of how a girl with nothing became the most powerful woman in Britain is the story we are going to follow tonight. Come back with me then to the very beginning of it, to the modest German court where she was born, and the early storms that very nearly swallowed her before her life had properly begun. The world Caroline was born into was that strange and fragmented Germany of the late 17th century, which was not a country at all in the way we would understand one, but a vast and intricate patchwork of several hundred separate states, large and small, each with its own ruler, its own court, its own little sovereignty, all of them loosely gathered under the fading umbrella of the old Holy Roman Empire. Her father, John Frederick, was the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, the ruler of one of the smaller of these states, a prince of an old and distinguished family, a branch of the House of Hohenzollern, the same dynasty whose senior line was even then rising to greatness in the north, and would one day rule all of Prussia and forge the German Empire. But the Ansbach branch was a minor one, its territory modest, its wealth limited, and John Frederick was a small prince by the measure of the age, ruling his little domain in comfortable obscurity far from the great centres of power. But he was Caroline's father by his second marriage to a princess named Eleanor Erdmuth of Saxe-Eisenach, and Caroline was one of the two children of that union, she and a younger brother who would in time inherit the Margraviate. It might have been an ordinary enough childhood, modest and provincial and secure, the unremarkable upbringing of a minor prince's daughter, had fate not intervened with the first of the many blows it would deal her. For when she was only 3 years old, her father fell ill and died, carried off by smallpox, that terrible and ever-present scourge of the age, which killed kings and peasants without distinction, and left those it spared often scarred for life. He was a young man still, barely past 30, and his death threw his little family into sudden uncertainty, for a widow and 2 small children, without the protection of a ruling father, were vulnerable creatures in that hard world, dependent on the goodwill and the calculations of others. It is worth pausing on that disease for a moment, because it will run through Caroline's whole story like a dark thread, and will become, in the end, the field of one of her greatest achievements. Smallpox was the deadliest killer of the 18th century, a horror we can scarcely imagine now that it has been driven from the earth, but which then stalked every household and every nursery, striking suddenly, killing perhaps a third of those it took hold of, and leaving many of the survivors blinded or hideously disfigured for the rest of their lives. It had already taken Caroline's father. It would, as we shall see, take others close to her, and it would one day move her, the orphaned child of one of its victims, to champion against it a strange and frightening new defence that would save countless lives and mark her out as a woman ahead of her age. But all of that lay far in the future. For now there was only a small girl of 3 who had lost her father, and a frightened widow trying to secure a future for her children, in a world that offered women and orphans very little security at all. The widowed Eleanor did what such women had to do, which was to seek the shelter of another marriage, and the marriage she made carried her and her children into far grander and far more dangerous waters than the quiet backwater of Ansbach. She married again, and this time to a truly great prince, John George, the Elector of Saxony, one of the most powerful rulers in all of Germany, a man whose court at Dresden was among the most magnificent in the empire. On the face of it, it was a brilliant match, a step up into the very first rank of German princely life, and it must have seemed to promise security and splendour for the little family from Ansbach. But it proved instead to be a descent into misery, for the great Elector was a man in the grip of a consuming and ungovernable passion for another woman, his mistress, whom he loved to the point of obsession, and he had no room in his heart or his life for the new wife he had taken for reasons of state. What followed was a wretched and a frightening few years for Caroline's mother, married to a man who did not want her and made no secret of it, who flaunted his mistress and neglected and humiliated his wife, and whose temper, inflamed by his hopeless passion, could turn to something close to violence. There is a dark story, very likely true, that the Elector on one occasion turned upon Eleanor in a rage with a drawn sword, and that she was saved from him only by the quick intervention of his own younger brother, who put himself between them and turned the blade aside. Whether or not every detail is exact, the marriage was plainly a thing of fear and unhappiness, and the small Caroline, growing up in the shadow of it, learned early and at first hand what a loveless dynastic marriage could do to a woman, how a wife could be at the mercy of a husband who did not care for her, how little protection rank and even a crown could offer against a cold or a cruel man. It was a lesson she would never forget, and it would shape, years later, the very different sort of marriage she was determined to make for herself. And then, with a grim familiarity, the same illness that had taken her father came for her stepfather too. The Elector's mistress fell ill with smallpox and died of it, and he, refusing to leave her side, caught the infection from her and followed her quickly into the grave. So Caroline's mother was widowed for the second time, and not long after, worn down perhaps by grief and disappointment and the hardness of her life, Eleanor herself sickened and died, leaving Caroline an orphan at the age of 13, with no father, no mother, no settled home, and no fortune to speak of. She and her brother were sent back to Ansbach, to the care of a half-brother who had little interest in the burden of a portionless young sister, and there the clever, grieving girl might have languished in obscurity, but one more unwanted orphan of a minor house, had not a remarkable benefactress reached out and changed the entire course of her life. It is to that rescue, and to the brilliant court that would make her, that we come now. The woman who reached out to the orphaned Caroline was one of the most extraordinary princesses of the age, and her name was Sophia Charlotte, the wife of the ruler of Brandenburg, the powerful North German state, whose master would shortly raise himself to the dignity of king in Prussia. Sophia Charlotte was no ordinary great lady. She was learned, brilliant, witty, and intellectually fearless. A woman of genuine philosophical mind who gathered around her the finest thinkers of the day, and delighted in nothing so much as a searching conversation about the deepest questions of religion and philosophy and the nature of the universe. She was the daughter of that same clever electress Sophia of Hanover, whom we may remember from other tales of this family, the Hanoverian matriarch, who would later be named heiress to the British throne, and she had inherited her mother's formidable intelligence and added to it a warmth and a generosity of spirit that made her beloved by all who knew her. And this remarkable mentor, hearing of the plight of the orphaned girl from Ansbach, took her in and made her, in effect, a daughter of her own. For Caroline, after the griefs and the fears of her early years, it was like stepping out of darkness into light. She was taken from the cold indifference of her half-brother's household and brought into the most cultivated and stimulating court in all of Germany, into the daily company of a woman who treated her with affection, who saw and prized her intelligence, and who set herself to draw out and develop the fine mind that lay, half-formed and untaught, within the grieving girl. Sophia Charlotte became to Caroline everything that fate had so far denied her: a mother, a teacher, a friend, and a model of what a woman could be, and she responded with all the devotion of a heart that had known too little love and was starving for it. The bond between the two became one of the deepest formative relationships of Caroline's life, and the older woman's influence would remain with her, shaping her mind and her character, long after death had parted them. The court of Sophia Charlotte was a place such as Caroline had never imagined, a true temple of the new learning that was then transforming the intellectual life of Europe. The Elector built his wife a beautiful palace outside Berlin, a place of gardens and music and elegant retirement, and there Sophia Charlotte presided over a salon of philosophers and scholars and artists, where the conversation ran freely over the boldest and most exciting questions of the age. The greatest ornament of that court, and the presiding genius of it, was the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the supreme minds of all human history, a mathematician and metaphysician and universal scholar of staggering range, who was Sophia Charlotte's friend, an intellectual companion, and a frequent presence in her circle. And it was here, In this atmosphere of fearless inquiry, that the young Caroline met Leibniz and began a friendship and a correspondence with that towering intellect that would last for the rest of his life and feed her mind for years to come. But it is hard to overstate how unusual all of this was for a woman of that time and what it did for her. Princesses of the age were not, as a rule, educated to think. They were trained to dance and to dress and to make a good marriage, to be ornamental and agreeable and fruitful, and their minds were left largely uncultivated, for an intelligent woman was widely regarded as something faintly unnatural and certainly inconvenient. But in Sophia Charlotte's court, Caroline found herself in a place where a woman's intelligence was honoured rather than feared, where she could read and question and argue and learn, where the conversation of philosophers was open to her, and her own thoughts were taken seriously. She seized the opportunity with both hands. She read deeply in philosophy and theology, the two chief fields of speculation in that age. She followed and joined in the debates of the learned men around her. She developed a genuine love of ideas and a real capacity for hard thinking that set her apart from almost every other princess of her rank in Europe. The frightened orphan was becoming a formidable intellect, and the foundation was being laid for the philosopher queen she would one day be. But fate, which had already taken so much from Caroline, was not done with her, and it now dealt her another grievous blow, taking from her the beloved mentor who had given her so much. In the early months of the year 1705, Sophia Charlotte, still only in her 30s, fell suddenly and fatally ill while on a visit to her native Hanover, and died, leaving Caroline once again bereft, robbed of the woman who had been mother and teacher and dearest friend to her. It was a deep and a lasting grief, and she mourned her truly, for she had lost not only a protector, but the person who, more than any other, had made her what she was. And yet the gift Sophia Charlotte had given her could not be taken away, for it lived now in Caroline's own mind and character, in the trained intelligence and the love of learning and the largeness of spirit that the older woman had nurtured in her. Caroline would carry Sophia Charlotte with her for the rest of her life, and would one day recreate, in her own royal household across the sea, something of that lost court of philosophers and free inquiry. But first she faced a great decision, the decision that would define her character before all the world, for even as she grieved, one of the greatest princes in Europe was seeking her hand, and the offer he made would test everything she was. That fateful choice is where our story turns now. By the time she came into her early 20s, Caroline had grown into a young woman who turned heads and engaged minds in equal measure, and she was, despite her want of fortune, one of the most sought-after brides in Germany. She was, by every account, genuinely beautiful, fair-haired and shapely and graceful, with a warmth and a vivacity that drew people to her, and she had, on top of her beauty, the rarer and more dangerous attraction of a brilliant and well-furnished mind, so that to talk with her was to be surprised and delighted by a quickness and a depth one did not expect in a young princess. She had no dowry to speak of, no rich inheritance to bring a husband, but she had connections of the first rank through her Prussian guardians, and she had her own remarkable person, and these together made her a prize that great men were willing to compete for, and the greatest of them all now entered the lists, with an offer that would have turned almost any other head in Europe. The suitor was Charles, the Archduke of Austria, a prince of the mighty house of Habsburg, the younger son of the Holy Roman Emperor himself, and at that moment one of the most glittering marriage prospects on the entire continent. For Europe was then convulsed by a great war over the succession to the throne of Spain, and Charles was the candidate of a powerful alliance for that very throne, put forward to rule the vast Spanish Empire that stretched across the world, and beyond even that dazzling prospect lay the possibility, which would in time become reality, that he might one day succeed to the imperial crown itself and become the Holy Roman Emperor, the highest secular dignity in all of Christendom. To marry Charles, then, was to stand at the threshold of becoming Queen of Spain, with the wealth of the Indies at one's feet, and perhaps in time Empress over the German lands as well, the First Lady of Europe. For a portionless orphan from the small court of Ansbach, it was an almost inconceivable elevation, a fortune beyond the wildest imaginings of her childhood, and her Prussian guardian, the new King Frederick, strongly encouraged the match, eager to see his ward make so spectacular a marriage. The overtures were made, the dazzling prize was held out, and all the world expected Caroline to seize it, for who, in that age or any other, refuses the offer of an empire? But there was a difficulty, and to her it was not a small one, but a matter that touched the very core of her being. The Habsburgs were the foremost Catholic dynasty in Europe, the great champions of the Old Faith, and any Protestant princess who married into that house would be required to convert, to abandon the Lutheran religion in which she had been raised, and which she held with deep and genuine conviction, and to embrace the Roman Catholic Church. The crown of Spain, the imperial prospect, the whole shining future, came at a price, and the price was her faith. And here the world discovered what manner of woman this orphan from Ansbach truly was. For Caroline, after long and serious consideration, for she did not refuse lightly or rashly, said no. She would not change her religion, not even for a crown, not even for the greatest crown in Europe. The faith she had been raised in, the faith that Sophia Charlotte and the thinkers of her circle had helped her to examine and to hold, not by mere habit but by conviction, was not a thing she was willing to trade away for worldly advantage, however immense. She weighed the empire in one hand and her conscience in the other, and she chose her conscience, and she let the empire go. It was an astonishing decision, and it sent a kind of shock through the courts of Europe for such firmness of principle, such willingness to refuse the highest prize the world could offer, rather than violate one's deepest beliefs, was a rare and a remarkable thing, and rarer still in a young woman of no fortune who had every worldly reason to accept it. It is worth dwelling on this refusal, because it tells us so much about who she was and would remain. It reveals, first, the depth and the seriousness of her religious conviction, which was real and considered and not to be lightly set aside. She was a thinking believer who had reflected on her faith and held it as a matter of intellectual as well as spiritual integrity. It reveals, too, her remarkable strength of will and independence of mind, her capacity to stand against the expectations of everyone around her, including her own powerful guardian, and to make her own judgment and abide by it whatever the cost. And it reveals a certain largeness of vision, a sense that there were things more valuable than even the most glittering worldly success, that a soul and a self were not to be bartered away for a throne. The young woman who could refuse an empire for the sake of her conscience was a person of formidable character, and that character would carry her, in time, to a different throne and a different greatness, one she would reach, not by surrendering herself, but by being wholly and unmistakably herself. For the refusal of Charles left her free, and into that freedom now came a very different sort of suitor, an awkward, hot-tempered young prince from a middling German electorate, who would offer her not an empire but something she valued far more. Let us turn now to him and to the marriage that made her. The prince who now sought Caroline's hand was George Augustus, the electoral prince of Hanover, the heir to that ambitious North German electorate, and the grandson of the very Electress Sophia, who was the mother of Caroline's beloved late mentor. He was a young man of no great height and no great beauty, fussy, hot-tempered, vain about small things, and lacking in the graces of manner, but he was honest and brave and not unkind. and he had been raised in the shadow of a famous family scandal that had shaped his whole attitude to marriage. For his own father, the cold and forbidding man who would later become King George I of Britain, had made a notorious and disastrous first marriage that had ended in betrayal and divorce, and the lifelong imprisonment of his discarded wife, a dark and a cautionary tale that hung over the whole House of Hanover. George Augustus had grown up motherless because of it, his own mother shut away on a distant heath, and he was determined, when his turn came, not to repeat his father's misery, but to find a wife he could actually love and live with. And so, in a charming and a telling episode, the young prince did something unusual. Rather than simply accept a bride chosen for him on paper, he resolved to see her for himself before committing, and he travelled to inspect her in disguise, going incognito to the court where she was staying so that he might observe her at his leisure and judge her with his own eyes, free to withdraw unnoticed if she did not please him. He need not have worried. He was charmed at once. He found her beautiful and warm and clever, everything the reports had promised and more, and he came away delighted, having lost his heart to her almost on sight. The match, which had in any case been favoured by his shrewd old grandmother, who had marked Caroline down as an ideal wife for her grandson, was quickly settled, and in the late summer of 1705, the two were married at the Hanoverian palace, and Caroline became the wife of the heir to the electorate. It was, against all the odds of dynastic matchmaking, a genuine love match, and it would remain, for all its strangeness and all its strains, a true and an enduring partnership to the end of Caroline's life. George Augustus loved her, in his blustering and imperfect way, with a real and a lasting devotion, and he admired her cleverness even when he could not match it, and she, for her part, came to understand her husband with extraordinary completeness, to see all his vanities and weaknesses, and to love him through them, and above all to learn how to manage him so deftly that she could guide him without his ever feeling guided. This understanding between them, this strange and unequal but genuine union of a hot-tempered, limited man and a brilliant, patient wife, would become one of the most remarkable royal marriages in history, and the foundation of all Caroline's later power. But that lay in the future. For now she was simply the happy young wife of the Hanoverian heir, settling into the life of the electoral court, and beginning the long business of bearing the children who would carry the dynasty forward. The years at Hanover, before the great change came that would carry them all to England, were on the whole good years for her, and she flourished in them. The court of Hanover was a grander and more formal place than the philosophical retreat of her girlhood, but it was presided over by the formidable old Electress Sophia, the mother of Caroline's lost mentor, and between the clever old woman and the clever young one there grew up a real bond of mutual respect and affection. Sophia was one of the sharpest minds of her generation, learned and witty and endlessly curious, and she found in Caroline a kindred spirit, a young protégé who could meet her in conversation and keep pace with her wide-ranging intelligence, and she took a deep liking to her grandson's wife. She thus found herself once again in the company of a brilliant older woman who valued her mind, and she continued, in the intervals of her domestic duties, to read and to think, and to keep up her correspondence with Leibniz and the learned world, nourishing the intellect that her circumstances might so easily have allowed to wither. And the domestic life was full, for she began almost at once to bear children, and she would in time be the mother of a large family. Her first child, a son, was born within a couple of years of the marriage, a boy named Frederick, who was the heir to the heir, the future of the dynasty, and who would grow up, by a sad irony we shall come to be the great grief and enemy of his mother's later days. Other children followed in time, daughters and sons, and she proved a fertile, and by the standards of the age a devoted mother. that the cruel customs of royal life would later tear some of her children from her care in ways that caused her bitter pain. In these Hanover days she also passed through a grave danger of her own, for she fell ill with the smallpox that had killed her father and her stepfather, and for a time her life hung in the balance. But she survived it, where so many did not, and her devoted husband, who refused to leave her side and caught a milder form of the disease himself, survived it too. She came through scarred but living, one of the fortunate ones, and the experience of having faced that killer and lived would stay with her and would bear remarkable fruit in years to come. But great events were now stirring far away across the sea, in the kingdom of Britain, that were about to lift this Hanoverian family out of their German obscurity and set them upon one of the greatest thrones in the world. That astonishing change of fortune is where we go now. The great change came about through one of those strange turns of dynastic accident that decided so much in the old world. The throne of Britain was held by Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart line, who despite many pregnancies had left no surviving child, and the law of that fiercely Protestant kingdom barred its crown from passing to the many Catholic claimants who stood nearest in blood. And so, casting about for the nearest Protestant heir, the British Parliament had settled the succession upon the old Electress Sophia of Hanover, Caroline's wise old friend, and after her upon her descendants. By a poignant stroke of timing, Sophia herself died in the early summer of 1714, only a few weeks before Queen Anne, missing by a hair's breadth the crown she had been promised, and so when Anne died that August, it was Sophia's son, Caroline's cold father-in-law, who inherited, becoming King George I of Great Britain. The Hanoverian family, German princes of a middling electorate, found themselves overnight the royal house of one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth, and they packed up their court and sailed across the sea to take possession of their astonishing new inheritance. She came to England then, in the autumn of that year, as the Princess of Wales, the wife of the new heir to the throne, and she arrived into a situation that called for every ounce of her intelligence and charm. The new royal family were strangers in their kingdom, German-speaking foreigners set over a proud and suspicious nation that knew little of them, and was inclined to like them less, and the new king did nothing to mend matters, for George I was a cold, awkward, intensely private man who spoke almost no English, cared little for his new subjects, and made no effort to win their affection. He longed always for his beloved Hanover, kept himself surrounded by his German attendants, and remained to the end of his life a remote and unpopular figure, a foreign king reigning over a people he did not understand and did not much wish to. Into this difficult situation Caroline brought exactly the qualities her father-in-law lacked, and she set herself with characteristic shrewdness to do what he would not, which was to make the new dynasty liked. She learned English, and learned it well where the king could barely manage a sentence of it. She took pains to understand the customs and the politics and the temper of her new country. She made herself agreeable and accessible and visibly delighted to be among her new people, and she charmed the English as her father-in-law never could. Where George I was a closed and forbidding presence, Caroline was warm and bright and engaging, quick to smile and quick to converse, and the contrast did not go unnoticed. People who could not warm to the dull old king found themselves drawn to his clever and gracious daughter-in-law, and she, together with her husband, who shared her wish to be accepted, became the more appealing and more English face of the new royal house. It was the beginning of a long campaign, conducted with consummate skill across many years, by which she did more than perhaps anyone else to root the foreign Hanoverian dynasty in the affections of its new kingdom, and it was a service to her adopted family whose importance is easy to overlook. But Caroline did far more than merely make herself agreeable, for she brought with her to England the mind that Sophia Charlotte had nurtured, and she now set about recreating, in her own royal household, something of that lost world of brilliant conversation and free inquiry that had shaped her youth. She gathered around her the wits and the writers and the thinkers of the age, making her court a magnet for the finest minds in the kingdom, a place where intelligence and learning and clever talk were prized and rewarded, as they had been in the court of her beloved mentor long ago. The great satirists and poets and philosophers of that golden age of English letters were drawn into her orbit, and she presided over them with a genuine and a knowledgeable delight, able to meet poets and divines and natural philosophers on something near their own ground, asking searching questions and following difficult arguments with an ease that astonished those who had not expected such depth in a princess. It quickly became apparent to everyone who came near the royal family that she was by a wide margin the most intelligent person in it, and very likely one of the most intelligent people in the entire kingdom. Her husband, for all his genuine qualities, was a man of limited mind and large vanity, easily flattered, easily angered, fussy over trifles and blind to large things. Her father-in-law was a cold and narrow man interested chiefly in his German lands and his private comforts. She towered over them both in understanding, in subtlety, in breadth of view, and the discrepancy was plain to every observer, though she herself, with the shrewdness that was her great gift, took endless care never to let it show in any way that might wound her husband's pride. She had learned long ago the hard lessons of what happened to royal wives who challenged their husbands, and she had no intention of ruling openly or of seeming to rule at all. Her power, when it came, would be exercised in the shadows, through patience and flattery and the most delicate of manipulations, and it would be all the greater for being invisible. But before she could come into that power, the family was plunged into a bitter and damaging quarrel that would test her to the utmost and cost her dearly. It is to that feud that we come now. The quarrel that now broke out between the king and his son was, on its surface, a petty thing, a squabble over precedence and wounded pride of the kind that festered so easily in princely families. But it ran on deep currents of mutual dislike, and it grew into a breach that split the royal house in two and inflicted on Caroline one of the cruelest sufferings of her life. George I and George Augustus had never loved each other. The cold father and the resentful son, and the son's growing popularity, set against the father's unpopularity, only sharpened the king's jealousy and suspicion of his heir. The open rupture came over a christening. When Caroline bore a new baby son, a quarrel erupted between the king and the prince over who should stand as godfather to the child, and George Augustus, hot-tempered as ever, lost control of himself and spoke insulting words to a great nobleman whom the king had favoured, in a scene that the king chose to treat as an intolerable affront. The king's response was swift and merciless. He placed his son under arrest, and then he expelled the Prince and Princess of Wales from the palace altogether, casting them out of his court and his presence. But the king did something far crueler than merely expel his son and daughter-in-law, something that struck at her in the tenderest place a mother can be struck. When he drove the parents out, he kept their children. The young sons and daughters of the Prince and Princess of Wales were declared to be in the king's charge, and were kept behind in the royal household, separated from their mother and father, who were now permitted to see them only rarely and under grudging conditions. It was the same cold, dynastic cruelty that this family had shown before, the same willingness to use children as instruments, and to tear them from a loving mother to serve the purposes of power, and it fell now upon her with devastating force. She was a devoted mother, and to be parted from her children, to be allowed only stilted and supervised visits to her own sons and daughters, while they were raised by others under the king's cold authority, was an agony to her, and she felt it as such, weeping bitterly at the separation and never reconciling herself to it. The cruelty was deepened almost beyond bearing when the new baby, the infant son over whose christening the whole quarrel had erupted, fell ill and died, still kept apart from his parents, so that she lost not only the company of her older children, but the very child whose birth had been the occasion of the disaster. To lose a baby was common enough in that age, and she, like most mothers of her time, had to learn to bear such losses, but to lose this one in the midst of the bitter separation, amid the wreckage of the family quarrel, was a peculiarly heavy blow, and it left a lasting wound. Through all of it, Caroline had to maintain her composure, to keep up the dignity expected of a princess before a watching world, to swallow her grief and her rage and present a calm face, even as her heart was breaking over her scattered and diminished family. It was a fearful test of the self-command she had been building all her life, and she passed it, but at a heavy cost in private suffering. Out of this misery, however, Caroline and her husband fashioned something formidable. For being cast out of the king's court, they set up a rival court of their own, and it became at once the brilliant and dangerous centre of everything opposed to the old king. They established themselves at a grand house in London, and there Caroline gathered her wits and her writers and her thinkers, and her husband gathered the politicians who were out of favour with the king, and between them they made their household into a glittering alternative to the dull and unpopular court of George I, a place where the opposition could rally and the discontented could gather. It was a school of politics for her, this period of open rivalry with the crown, and she learned in it much about the workings of power and faction and parliamentary management that would serve her well in the years to come. She watched, and she listened, and she calculated, and she came to understand the political world of her adopted country with a depth and a subtlety that few native-born politicians could match, building the knowledge and the connections that would one day make her the most effective political operator in the kingdom. And it was in these years of opposition that she formed the most important political alliance of her life, with the man who would be her chief partner in power, the rising statesman Robert Walpole. Walpole was a shrewd, worldly, immensely capable politician, the coming man of his party, and he attached himself to the household of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and there he and she took each other's measure and recognised in each other a kindred shrewdness. It was Walpole who eventually helped to engineer a patched-up reconciliation between the king and his son, a cold and formal peace that ended the open breach, though it never restored real warmth between father and son, and never fully gave Caroline back her lost children, who remained largely in the king's keeping. But the reconciliation returned the prince and princess to court, and it bound Caroline and Walpole together in a working partnership of mutual interest and mutual respect that would, when the old king at last died, place the real government of Britain very largely in their joined hands. We come now to the inoculation against a great killer that she championed, one of the most remarkable acts of her whole life. Among all the achievements of Caroline's remarkable life, there is one that stands apart, one act of intelligence and courage that reached beyond the world of courts and politics to touch the lives of ordinary people for generations to come, and that was her championing of inoculation against smallpox. We have seen what that disease meant in her age, the great killer that had taken her father and her stepfather and very nearly herself, the terror of every household, sparing neither rank nor youth, killing perhaps a third of those it seized, and leaving many of the rest blind or ruined. There was as yet no cure for it, and no certain protection against it, and humanity stood largely helpless before its recurring waves. But word had begun to reach Western Europe of a strange practice followed in the East, in the lands of the Ottoman Turks, a practice that seemed to offer some defence against the scourge, and it was she, more than any crowned head in Europe, who had the wit and the nerve to seize upon it. The practice was called inoculation or variolation, and to the people of that age it sounded like madness, for it consisted of deliberately giving a healthy person a small and controlled dose of the very disease one feared. A little matter taken from the sores of a mild case of smallpox would be introduced into a scratch in the skin of a healthy person, who would then, in most cases, develop only a mild form of the illness, suffer through it, recover, and emerge forever protected against catching the disease in its deadly natural form. It worked, though no one then understood why, by provoking the body's own defences in a controlled way, and though it carried a real risk of its own, for a small number of those inoculated did sicken badly or even die, that risk was many times smaller than the risk of catching smallpox in the ordinary way. The practice had been observed in Constantinople by an English noblewoman, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, herself a survivor of the disease that had scarred her face and killed her brother, and she had brought it home to England and had her own children inoculated, becoming its first great champion in the West. But it was a frightening and a controversial idea, deliberately to infect a healthy child with a deadly disease, and it met with deep suspicion and resistance, and it needed a powerful patron to give it standing and to overcome the public's fear. It found that patron in her. Caroline, with her trained and fearless mind, grasped at once both the promise of the thing and the need to prove it, and she set about establishing its safety with a rigour that would not have shamed a modern man of science. She would not simply take it on faith, nor recklessly expose her own children without evidence. She arranged instead for a careful trial, one of the first of its kind in the history of medicine. She obtained the king's permission for an experiment upon condemned criminals, prisoners under sentence of death in the great London prison, who were offered their lives in exchange for submitting to inoculation. Several of them agreed, and were inoculated, and were watched closely, and they all came through, taking the mild form of the disease and recovering, and earning their pardons. Then, to test the matter further, the procedure was tried upon a number of orphan children, and they too survived it safely. She had her proof. It worked, and it could be done with acceptable safety, and she had established the fact by deliberate trial rather than mere assertion. And then Caroline did the thing that gave her championing of inoculation its real moral weight and its power to persuade a frightened nation, for having satisfied herself that it was safe, she submitted her own beloved children to it. She had 2 of her young daughters inoculated against the smallpox, exposing the princesses of the blood to the controlled disease in order to protect them from the deadly one, and in order, just as importantly, to show the watching kingdom that she believed in it so completely that she would stake her own children's lives upon it. It was an act of real courage, for she was a mother who had already buried children and knew the agony of such loss, and she was knowingly accepting a small risk to her daughters' lives, but she judged the small risk worth the great protection, and she was willing to lead by her own example. The princesses came through safely, and the effect upon the public was profound. If the Princess of Wales would inoculate her own daughters, the people reasoned, then surely it could be trusted, and the practice, which had been viewed with such fear and suspicion, began to spread and to gain acceptance, saving lives that would otherwise have been lost in their thousands. In championing inoculation, Caroline showed herself at her very best, and revealed the qualities that made her so remarkable a figure, for here were her fine intelligence, her respect for evidence and willingness to test rather than merely believe, her courage in accepting personal risk for a public good, and her largeness of vision in seeing beyond the narrow concerns of her station to the welfare of ordinary people. The great philosopher Voltaire, who admired her enormously, wrote that this princess, for all her crowns and titles, seemed born to encourage useful knowledge and the good of mankind, a benevolent philosopher even upon a throne. And in the matter of inoculation, that judgment was fully earned. She had used her royal position not merely for display or self-advancement, but to advance a great practical good, to push forward against fear and ignorance, a defense against one of humanity's deadliest enemies, decades before the more famous discoveries that would eventually banish the disease from the earth altogether. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the line that runs from Caroline's bold championing to the eventual triumph over the disease, for she stands near the beginning of one of the remarkable success stories of the human struggle against suffering. The crude and frightening practice she helped to establish was the rough forerunner of the safer method that a later physician would discover toward the end of that same century, and that improved method, refined and spread across the world over the generations that followed, would in the end drive the ancient killer from the earth entirely, until at last, in our own age, smallpox became the first, and so far the only disease that human effort has wholly wiped out. She did not foresee that distant victory, and she played only an early part in the long campaign that won it, but she played it bravely and well, lending the weight of her position and the example of her own children to a practice that fear and ignorance might otherwise have strangled in its infancy, and helping to set humanity on the road that would lead, in time, to a triumph she could never have imagined. The orphaned daughter of a man the disease had killed had struck a real blow against it, and the blow told. It was a true and a lasting achievement, and it deserves to be remembered among the finest things any queen ever did. But great events were now approaching that would lift Caroline from the second place she had so long occupied to the very summit of the kingdom, for the old king was nearing his end. And so we come to Caroline's accession as queen. The old king died as he had lived, on the road to his beloved Hanover, struck down by a seizure in his carriage in the summer of 1727 as he hurried back toward the German lands he had always preferred to the kingdom he ruled. The news was brought in haste to England, and George Augustus, the resentful son so long kept from real power by the father he had hated, was at last a king, and she, the orphan from Ansbach who had refused an empire, was at last a queen. But the accession brought with it, in its very first hours, a crisis that tested all of Caroline's political skill and revealed at once how the new reign was really going to be governed. For the formidable minister Robert Walpole, who had made his peace with the old king and risen to dominate his government, was by no means assured of keeping his place under the new one. George II, in the manner of heirs who have chafed under their fathers, was inclined to sweep away his father's men and bring in his own, and he had another favourite in mind for the chief place, and Walpole's whole career hung suddenly in the balance. It was she who rescued him, and in saving him set the pattern of the reign. She understood, as her blustering husband did not, that Walpole was the ablest man in the kingdom, and the surest guarantor of the dynasty's stability and her family's prosperity, and she was determined to keep him. Walpole, for his part, knew exactly where his salvation lay, and he made his approach not to the king directly, but through the queen, trusting to her shrewdness and their long alliance. Between them they managed the new king with consummate skill. Walpole arranged, through Caroline's influence, a financial settlement so generous to the crown that George II, who loved money, was quickly reconciled to keeping the man who had secured it for him, and the favourite who had seemed about to displace Walpole proved unequal to the business of high office and faded away. Within days the crisis had passed, and Walpole was confirmed in his power, and he owed that power, and knew he owed it, very largely to the Queen. The lesson was not lost on him, and it shaped everything that followed, for Walpole now understood that the road to the king ran through her, and he governed accordingly. The coronation followed in the autumn, a splendid affair for which the great composer Handel, who enjoyed the royal couple's favour, wrote magnificent anthems whose grandeur still rings down the centuries, and she was crowned queen with all the ancient ceremony of her adopted kingdom. But the true significance of the new reign lay not in its pageantry, but in its hidden mechanics, in the quiet arrangement of power that now took shape behind the throne, and that arrangement placed Caroline at the very centre of the government of Britain. For the next 10 years until her death, she would be the real ruling intelligence of the kingdom, the hidden hand that guided the king and worked in concert with his chief minister to direct the affairs of state, and she would exercise that power with such subtlety that her blustering husband never quite grasped how completely he was being led. It was one of the most remarkable feats of political management in the history of the monarchy, and it deserves to be understood in detail. The heart of Caroline's method was that she never, ever appeared to rule, and never let her husband suspect for a moment that he was being managed. George II was a proud, touchy, vain man, fiercely jealous of his own authority and dignity, who would have flown into a fury at the slightest hint that his wife was governing him, and who genuinely believed himself to be very much the master in his own house and kingdom. She understood this perfectly, and she built her whole exercise of power upon a foundation of the most elaborate and patient deference. She flattered him constantly, deferred to him in public on every point, praised his judgment, agreed with his opinions, and took endless care to let every decision appear to be his own. When she wished to move him toward some course of action, she did it by indirection, planting ideas so that he would come to think them his, arguing against the thing she secretly wanted, so that he would embrace it in opposition to her, managing his moods and his vanity with the skill of a lifetime's study of the man. He would rage and bluster and lay down the law, and she would seem to yield, and somehow, again and again, the policy that emerged would be the one she and Walpole had quietly determined upon in advance. For the Queen and the Minister worked hand in glove throughout the reign. The cleverest woman and the cleverest man in the kingdom joined in a partnership of mutual interest that governed Britain between them. Walpole would settle with her, in their private conferences, what was to be done, and she would then undertake to bring the king round to it, deploying upon her husband all the arts of persuasion and management that she had perfected over the years. It was said of Walpole that he had got the right sow by the ear, meaning that he had understood where the real power lay and had cultivated the Queen accordingly, and the saying captured the truth of the matter exactly. The government of the country rested, for those years, upon this hidden triangle of the able minister, the clever queen, and the proud king who imagined himself the author of policies that had in fact been shaped without his knowledge by the two of them. It was government by manipulation, and it might be thought to reflect little credit on anyone involved, but it gave the kingdom a decade of able and stable rule, and it kept the Hanoverian dynasty secure through years that might otherwise have been dangerous, and it was by any measure an extraordinary achievement for a woman in an age that allowed women no formal power at all. And there were times when Caroline's power was not hidden at all, but open and acknowledged, for when the king went abroad, he left the kingdom formally in her hands. To those regencies when she ruled Britain in her own name, we turn next. Several times during the reign, the king's love of his native Hanover drew him away from Britain for months at a stretch, back to the German electorate where he felt most at home, and on each of these occasions he left the government of his kingdom formally in the hands of his wife. She was appointed guardian of the realm, vested with the royal authority to govern in the king's absence, and on 4 separate occasions across the reign she ruled Britain openly, and in her own right, presiding over the council, conducting the business of state, making the decisions that the king's absence required. This was a most unusual elevation, for queens consort were rarely entrusted with real governing power, and it placed Caroline for these intervals in a position of open authority to match the hidden power she wielded the rest of the time. She discharged the trust ably, managing affairs with the same competence and judgment she brought to everything, and she is rightly credited with helping to steady the dynasty and the country through a period when firm and sensible direction at the centre was sorely needed. The regencies were not without their dramas, and one of them confronted Caroline with a crisis that revealed both the limits of royal power and the temper of her adopted kingdom. During one of her periods as regent, a notorious affair unfolded in Scotland, in the city of Edinburgh, where a captain of the city guard named Porteous had been condemned to death for having ordered his men to fire upon a crowd, killing several people. When it appeared that the captain might be reprieved, a great mob rose in the city, broke into the prison where he was held, dragged him out, and put him to death themselves, in open defiance of the law and the crown. Caroline, governing as regent, was outraged at this lawless act, this brazen usurpation by a mob of the crown's own authority over life and death, and she reacted with anger to the insult to royal justice. The affair caused great difficulty and tested her judgment, for the government had to respond to so flagrant a challenge without further inflaming a proud and touchy nation, and it showed her, if she needed showing, the wild and ungovernable currents that ran beneath the surface of the kingdom she helped to rule. Yet even in her regencies, Caroline's power had its galling limits, for her husband, jealous as ever of his authority, took care that she should not enjoy too free a hand, and he resented and curtailed her independence even as he relied upon it. He left her in charge because he trusted her competence and her loyalty above anyone's, and yet he could not bear the thought that she might rule too much in her own right, and he bristled at any sign that she was overstepping the bounds he set. It was the contradiction that ran through their whole partnership, that he depended on her utterly, and yet could not openly acknowledge it, that he left his kingdom in her hands, and yet grudged her the power he gave her. She managed this contradiction, as she managed everything about her difficult husband, with patience and tact, and an unfailing show of deference, never pressing her advantage too far, never letting him feel diminished, always returning the authority gracefully into his hands when he came home. It was exhausting work, this perpetual management of a proud and jealous man, but she never relaxed it, for it was the price of all her influence. The deepest mystery of Caroline's life, and the foundation of all her power, was her marriage, and it was a far stranger and more complicated thing than it appeared from the outside. For all that the king loved and depended upon her, he was persistently unfaithful to her, keeping mistresses throughout their married life, and making no great secret of the fact, in the manner of kings of that age, who regarded such liberties as their natural prerogative. The chief of these mistresses for many years was a lady of Caroline's own household, who served the queen as one of her attendants even as she shared the king's bed, so that Caroline had the peculiar humiliation of being waited upon by her husband's lover. A lesser or a prouder woman might have made war upon the mistresses, might have raged and wept and tried to drive them out, and might have destroyed her own position in the process. But she was far too clever for that, and she chose instead the harder and the wiser course of tolerance and management. She judged, with her usual shrewd realism, that the king's mistresses were a far smaller threat to her than her own jealousy would be, and that she would keep her hold over her husband, not by fighting his infidelities, but by rising above them. She tolerated the mistresses, was civil to them, kept them where she could see them and control them, and even, it was said, encouraged the king to talk to her about them, so that she remained always his closest confidant, the one person to whom he told everything, the indispensable centre of his life around which the lesser women came and went. For the truth was that George II Whatever his wandering appetites, loved and needed Caroline as he loved and needed no one else. She was his counsellor, his comfort, his anchor, the one fixed point in his world, and the mistresses were a passing indulgence beside the deep and total dependence of his heart upon hers. She understood this perfectly, and she built her security upon it, securing her real and lasting hold over him precisely by refusing to compete with women who were no real rivals at all. It was a marriage of strange and unequal devotion, of infidelity laid over genuine and unbreakable love, and it worked, after its peculiar fashion, to the end. But there was one relationship in Caroline's life that all her skill could not manage, one bond that turned to poison and brought her the deepest grief of her later years, and that was her relationship with her eldest son. That bitter quarrel is where we turn now. The great grief of Caroline's later years was her eldest son, Frederick, and the roots of that grief lay, as so often in this family, in the cold dynastic customs that had separated parents from children a generation before. When the Hanoverian family had moved to England in 1714, the little Frederick, then a boy of 7, had been left behind in Hanover to be raised there as the family's representative in the German lands they still ruled, and so for some 14 years, the whole of his childhood and youth, he grew up apart from his parents, an ocean away, scarcely knowing his mother and father at all. By the time he was finally brought to England as a grown man of 21, he was very nearly a stranger to her and George, a young man formed by other hands, with his own habits and his own debts and his own grievances, and the long separation had done its work, pulling out the natural bond between parents and child, and leaving in its place a wary distance that soon curdled into something far worse. It is a cruel irony that this family, which had suffered so much from the tearing apart of parents and children, should have inflicted the same wound upon the next generation and reaped the same bitter harvest. For just as George II had grown up hating the father who had been cold to him, so now Frederick and his parents fell into a mutual antipathy that deepened, year by year, into open and venomous hatred. Frederick, finding himself a grown heir with little money, little influence, and parents who regarded him with suspicion and dislike, did exactly what his father had done before him, and made himself the centre of political opposition to the king, gathering around him all the discontented and the ambitious, setting up his household as a rival court, and waging a running war of faction and provocation against his own parents. The pattern that had divided George I from George II now repeated itself exactly, the heir in bitter opposition to the crown, and she found herself in her own family replaying the very tragedy of estrangement she had witnessed a generation before. What is most striking and most painful is the sheer intensity of the loathing that grew up between Caroline and her son, for it went far beyond ordinary family friction into a region of real and bitter hatred, shocking to behold in a mother. She came to detest Frederick with a passion that she made little effort to conceal in private, speaking of him in terms of extraordinary harshness, calling him the greatest liar and the greatest beast in the world, declaring that the sight of him was her torment, even in her blackest moods, wishing him out of her life altogether. These were terrible things for a mother to say of her son, and they have shocked posterity as they shocked some who heard them at the time. But they were the measure of how completely the relationship had broken down, of how the long separation, and the political warfare, and the clash of wills had poisoned what should have been the most natural love in the world. There were faults on both sides, no doubt, for Frederick could be provoking and devious and unkind, and the parents could be cold and unjust, but the result was a family tragedy of real depth, a mother and her firstborn locked in mutual hatred, and it cast a long shadow over Caroline's last years. The poison came to its crisis in a single shocking episode, in the final year of Caroline's life, an act of provocation by Frederick, so calculated and so cruel that it severed the last threads between him and his parents for good. Frederick's wife was expecting their first child, and the birth of a royal grandchild should have been an occasion of family joy and family ceremony, with the king and queen present or near at hand as custom and dignity required. But Frederick, determined to deny his parents any part in the event, did a thing of breathtaking spite. When his wife went into labour in the middle of the night at the palace where the court was gathered, he bundled the poor labouring woman out of the house in secret and rushed her by carriage through the dark to another residence, miles away, purely so that the child should not be born under his parents' roof or in his mother's presence. It was a reckless and a dangerous act, risking the lives of his wife and the coming child for the sake of a gesture of contempt, and it horrified and enraged the king and queen when they discovered it. The king's response was to expel Frederick from the court altogether, casting him out as George I had once cast out George II, and the breach was now complete and final. Caroline, for her part, was past forgiveness, and she made no secret of the depth of her anger and her hurt. The midnight flight, with its reckless cruelty and its open declaration of contempt, had killed whatever remained of her feeling for her son, and she did not expect, and perhaps did not wish, ever to be reconciled with him. It was a wretched state of affairs, a family torn apart at the highest level, the heir to the throne banished and at war with his parents, and it weighed heavily on Caroline in what were to prove the last months of her life. For she did not know, as the autumn of that year came on, that her time was almost spent, that the long-hidden flaw in her own body was about to declare itself, and that the bitter quarrel with her son would never now be mended. But before we come to her ending, we should look at the other and the brighter side of her queenship, the life of the mind that she never abandoned even at the height of her power, for it was there that the truest Caroline was always to be found. Let us look at it now. For all the politics and the family strife that filled her days, the truest and most constant thing about Caroline was the life of her mind, the love of ideas and learning that Sophia Charlotte had kindled in her so long ago, and that she never, in all her years of power, allowed to die. She remained to the end a genuine intellectual, a woman who read deeply and thought hard and delighted in the company of clever people and difficult questions, and she made her royal court, as she had always meant to, a place where learning and philosophy and the free play of mind were honoured and encouraged. She built up a great library. She patronised scholars and writers and musicians. She kept up her own reading in the demanding fields of philosophy and theology, and she carried into the heart of the English court something of that spirit of fearless inquiry she had breathed as a girl in the salon of her beloved mentor. It is this, perhaps, more than all her political cunning, that makes her so attractive a figure across the centuries, the sense of a first-rate mind making the most of itself in the most unlikely of circumstances, a queen who was also, and more deeply, a thinker. The most remarkable monument to this side of Caroline is a famous exchange of letters that she herself set in motion and sustained, one of the celebrated philosophical debates of the whole age, the correspondence between her old friend Leibniz and an English champion of the rival philosophy. The matter at issue was nothing less than the fundamental nature of the universe, the questions of space and time and matter and motion, of the place of God in the workings of the world, the deepest questions that the new science and the new philosophy had thrown open. On one side stood Leibniz, the great German metaphysician of Caroline's youth. On the other stood an English divine and philosopher who spoke for the towering authority of Isaac Newton and the new physics that was transforming humanity's picture of the cosmos. And it was she, standing between the two intellectual worlds she belonged to, the German philosophy of her upbringing and the English science of her adopted home, who brought the two thinkers into debate, passing their letters back and forth, prompting and encouraging the exchange, following its difficult arguments with real understanding. That a queen consort should not merely have patronized, but actually facilitated and followed. One of the supreme philosophical debates of the era tells us everything about the quality of her mind, and the correspondence she fostered is studied by philosophers to this very day. Her interests ran as strongly to religion as to philosophy, and here her position gave her a reach that mere private conviction never could, for the Queen had a real hand in the government of the Church. The appointments of bishops and the favour of the Crown in matters of the Church passed in good part through her influence, and she used that influence with deliberate care, advancing clergymen whose learning and temper she approved and shaping, in her quiet way, the character of the Church's leadership across the reign. She took a genuine and an active interest in the theological controversies of her day, following their twists and their arguments with the same hard attention she brought to philosophy, and she made her patronage a real force in the religious life of the kingdom. It was one more field in which her intelligence and her hidden power worked together, the cultivated mind and the practical influence joined, as they were joined in everything she touched. She left a charming and a characteristic monument to her love of learning in the gardens she laid out at one of the royal retreats where she built. Among the lawns and groves, a curious ornamental hermitage, a little grotto or garden temple, dedicated to the great minds she admired. Within it she placed the busts of the foremost British thinkers and natural philosophers, the men whose discoveries had remade the understanding of the world, Newton above all, and the leading philosophers and scientists who stood with him, enshrined in stone in the Queen's garden as objects of honour and contemplation. It was a kind of shrine to human reason, a quiet declaration of what she valued and revered, and it expressed, in the gentle language of a garden, the deepest commitments of her mind. A queen who built in her pleasure grounds a temple to philosophers and men of science, rather than to gods or ancestors or military glory, was a queen of an unusual and an admirable caste, and the little hermitage stands, in memory, as a fitting emblem of her whole inner life. The great Voltaire, the sharpest and most celebrated mind of the age, who knew her and admired her, summed her up in a phrase that has stuck to her ever since, calling her a philosopher upon the throne, a princess who used her royal position to encourage useful knowledge and the good of mankind, and who never lost an opportunity to learn or to do good. It was a generous tribute from a man not given to flattering the great, and it was deserved, for she was, in the truest sense, an enlightened queen, a ruler whose power was joined to genuine intelligence and genuine cultivation and a genuine concern for the advancement of knowledge and the welfare of her people. In an age of dull and brutal and merely ornamental royalty, she stood out as something finer, a crowned head who was also a real and a serious mind, and it is this above all that secures her a place among the most remarkable women ever to have worn a crown. But this brilliant and cultivated life was now drawing toward a sudden and a painful close, for the Queen carried within her a hidden affliction that was about to bring her down. We come now to her final illness, and to her death. The affliction that would kill Caroline was an old one, and she had carried it in secret for many years, hiding it from almost everyone out of a pride and a modesty that would, in the end, cost her her life. Some years before, in bearing the last of her many children, she had suffered an internal rupture, an injury of the kind that childbearing not uncommonly inflicted in an age that had no proper means to treat it, and the chicken had never healed. It was the sort of condition that a woman of her time was expected to bear in silence, a private and an embarrassing affliction not to be spoken of, and she, with her iron self-command and her horror of any show of weakness, had chosen to conceal it almost entirely, confiding in only one or two people and hiding her discomfort from the world. For years she went about her duties, governed the kingdom, presided over her court, and managed her husband, all the while carrying within her this hidden and worsening injury, enduring the pain and the difficulty of it without complaint and without allowing it to show. It was a fateful concealment, and it speaks volumes about her and about her age. Her pride, her stoicism, her refusal to appear weak or to trouble others with her private sufferings were qualities of real strength, and they had served her well across a lifetime of difficulty. But in this they betrayed her, for had she been more willing to acknowledge her condition and submit to what care the age could offer, she might perhaps have been helped, or at least more gently treated, before the thing grew mortal. Instead, she hid it until it could be hidden no longer, until the long-neglected injury, aggravated no doubt by the strains and the years, at last turned acute and brought her, suddenly and agonizingly, to her deathbed. The very self-command that had been the secret of all her power proved, in this one matter, her undoing, and there is a sad irony in it, that the woman who managed everything, who controlled her husband and her court and her kingdom with such consummate skill, should have managed her own ailing body into an early grave. The crisis came in the late autumn of 1737. She was seized in the midst of her ordinary duties by a sudden and violent pain, the long-hidden injury declaring itself at last in earnest, and she was forced to take to her bed, gravely, and as it would prove fatally ill. There is a characteristic story that even now, even as the agony struck her, she struggled to maintain her composure and to get through a public engagement before yielding to it. So deeply ingrained was her lifelong habit of hiding her sufferings behind a calm and dignified face. But the pain was past mastering, and she could conceal it no longer, and she gave herself up at last to the physicians and the surgeons. What followed was a terrible ordeal, for the medicine of that age, for all its confidence, had little real power against such an injury, and what it did have was crude and cruel beyond anything we can easily imagine. The doctors did what the doctors of that day did, which was to bleed her, and to purge her, and to dose her, none of which could touch the real trouble. And then the surgeons set to work upon her, operating upon the rupture in an attempt to repair what had gone wrong, cutting into her body in a series of dreadful procedures. And all of this was done without any of the means of deadening pain that later ages would discover, without anything to send her into merciful sleep or to dull the agony of the knife. She endured the surgeon's work fully conscious and fully feeling, in pain of an intensity that is appalling to contemplate. Through it all, by every account, Caroline showed a courage and a stoic fortitude that astonished those around her, bearing the unbearable with a composure and even a wit that did not desert her, enduring the knife and the agony with the same iron self-command she had shown all her life. But it was of no use. The injury was past repair, the damage had gone too far, and despite all the surgeon's cruel efforts her condition only worsened, the wound festering beyond any hope until it became clear to everyone and to herself that she was dying. She met the knowledge of her death as she had met everything else in her life, with clear-eyed courage and unbroken composure, and she set about the business of dying with the same competence and self-possession she had brought to the business of living. There was no panic in her, no collapse, no railing against her fate. There was only the calm ordering of her final hours, the saying of what needed to be said, the arranging of what needed to be arranged, the facing of the end with open eyes and a steady mind. She had a little time still, days rather than hours, in which to make her farewells and settle her affairs, and prepare for death, and she used that time with characteristic clarity and strength. And in those last days there unfolded at her bedside some of the most famous and most revealing scenes of her whole story, scenes that show us in the very face of death exactly who this remarkable woman was. To her deathbed we turn next, The scenes at Caroline's deathbed have come down to us in vivid detail, for she was a queen, and her dying was a public event, attended and recorded, and they show her courage and her wit and her clear judgment holding firm to the very last. Her estranged son Frederick, hearing that his mother was dying, sent word asking to be allowed to come to her, to see her one last time, and perhaps to make his peace. But the king would not permit it, his anger at his son's recent cruelty still burning, and he refused to let Frederick approach the dying queen. She complied with her husband's decision, and did not insist on seeing the son with whom she had been so bitterly at war. But she was not without mercy at the end, for she sent Frederick, through the trusted Walpole, a message of forgiveness, releasing him from her anger before she died, even as she declined to see his face. It was a characteristic act, this final gesture, clear-eyed and dignified and just, neither pretending to a tenderness she did not feel, nor carrying her resentment into eternity, but forgiving the wrong while keeping her distance from the wrongdoer, as her judgment told her was right. The most famous moment of all came in an exchange between the dying queen and her grief-stricken husband, an exchange that captures better than any description could the strange and the genuine character of their long marriage. The king, utterly distraught at the prospect of losing the wife who was the centre of his whole existence, wept and lamented at her bedside, inconsolable, and she, calm and practical even now, urged him, as she lay dying, to marry again after she was gone, to take another wife to comfort him and fill the place she was leaving. At this the king broke out, through his tears, in a passionate protest that he would never, never take another wife, but would have only mistresses instead, and Caroline, with the dry wit that did not desert her even on her deathbed, replied that the one need not in the least prevent the other. It is a small exchange, half comic and half unbearably sad, and it tells us everything, the king's clumsy, blubbering, genuine devotion, declaring even in his grief that no woman could replace her, and the queen's clear, amused, unshockable intelligence, seeing him and his nature and their whole marriage with perfect understanding and loving him through it to the end. In those few words the truth of their union stands revealed, the strange and unequal and oddly real love that had bound the clever woman and the limited man across 32 years. She lingered a few days more, the injury festering past saving, her strength ebbing, and then, after long suffering borne with unbroken fortitude, she died, in the late autumn of 1737, in her royal palace in London, with her husband and her children, those who were permitted to her, gathered round. She was 54 years old, and she had crowded into those years more of interest and achievement than a dozen ordinary lives, rising from a portionless and orphaned childhood to the summit of one of the great kingdoms of the earth, and ruling it, in all but name, with a skill and a wisdom that few who held the formal title of king ever matched. The clever girl who had refused an empire for her conscience, the philosopher queen who had corresponded with the greatest minds of her age, the mother who had braved a killer disease to protect her children and her people, the hidden ruler who had governed a kingdom through a husband she managed with such love and such art, was gone, and the light of one of the most remarkable intelligences ever to grace a throne was put out. The grief of those who had known and valued her was deep and genuine, and nowhere deeper than in the heart of the husband she left behind. George II, for all his infidelities, was shattered by her death, and his grief was real and lasting and strangely moving in so unsentimental a man. He had lost not merely a wife, but the prop and the centre of his entire existence, the one person who had understood him and guided him and loved him through all his blustering and his failings, and he never recovered from the loss. He declared, in his blunt way, that he had known many women in his life, but that not one of them had been fit so much as to buckle Caroline's shoe, and the rough tribute, for all its crudeness, rang with a real and a desolate sincerity. And true to the vow he had wept out at her deathbed, he never did take another wife. For the remaining 23 years of his life, long as they were, the king who had kept mistresses throughout his marriage remained, in the matter of marriage, faithful to his dead queen, never replacing her, never even seriously contemplating it, carrying his loss to the end of his own long life. Let us turn now to the strange and touching memorial he made of that loss, and to Caroline's place in the memory of her adopted country. The king's devotion expressed itself, in the end, in a gesture at once strange and deeply touching, a final arrangement that bound him to her beyond the grave. When she was buried, with much state and ceremony in the ancient abbey that was the resting place of England's kings and queens, the king gave instructions concerning his own eventual burial that revealed the depth of his attachment. He had a particular kind of coffin prepared for her, and directed that when he himself should die and be laid beside her, the adjoining sides of their 2 coffins should be drawn out and removed, so that their remains might mingle together, and the 2 of them be joined in death into a single rest. It was an extraordinary thing for so unsentimental a man to arrange, this literal commingling of their dust, and when he died at last, 23 years later, full of age, his wishes were carried out, and the sides of the coffins were withdrawn, and the king who had been so faithless and so devoted was united at last with the queen he had never replaced. There is something that catches at the heart in it, this final union of the clever woman and the limited man mingled together beneath the abbey stones, their long and strange and genuine partnership sealed forever in the dark. Her funeral was marked by the music of the great composer, who had so often graced her court, for Handel composed a solemn and magnificent anthem for the occasion, a setting of words of mourning whose grave beauty rose through the abbey to lament the passing of the queen who had been his patron and his friend. The grief was widespread and genuine, for she had been respected and even loved by many who understood something of what she had been and done, by the politicians who had worked with her, by the scholars and writers she had favoured, by the ordinary people who had benefited from her championing of inoculation and warmed to her over the years. She was, as it happened, the last queen consort to be buried in that great abbey of the kings, a fitting distinction for a woman who had been, in substance if never in name, more truly a ruler than many a crowned monarch laid there before her. Her death changed the political landscape of the kingdom, and not for the better, for it removed the hidden keystone upon which much of the government had rested, and its effects were soon felt. She had been the indispensable channel between the king and his chief minister, the means by which Walpole's policies were quietly conveyed into the royal will, and with her gone that channel was broken, and Walpole found himself bereft of his most valuable ally and his surest access to the king's mind. The great minister struggled on for a few years more, but his position was weakened by the loss of the queen who had managed his master for him, and before long his ascendancy came to an end, and he fell from the power he had held so long. It was a measure of how central Caroline had been to the whole working of the government, that her death should have helped to bring down the most powerful minister of the age, and a reminder, if any were needed, of how much real authority had been concentrated all those years in the hands of a woman who held no formal office at all. So passed Caroline of Ansbach, and with her something rare and fine went out of the royal life of her adopted country. The king lived on for many years, an old and increasingly solitary figure, brave and stubborn and dull, going through the motions of a reign that had lost its guiding intelligence, and the kingdom was governed by other hands well enough, but without the peculiar grace of mind that the dead queen had brought to it. The son, with whom she had quarrelled so bitterly, never did succeed to the throne, for Frederick died before his father, and it was Frederick's son, Caroline's grandson, born after her death and raised in a different world, who would in time become king, the long-reigning monarch under whom the kingdom would lose an empire in the west and gain another in the east, and whose own long descent into the shadows of the mind would form a tragedy of a different kind. But all that lay in the future. For the present there was only the absence of Caroline, the strange quiet at the centre of things where her quick intelligence had been, the sense that a singular and irreplaceable mind had passed out of the world. Yet before we take our final leave of her, there are several figures in her story we have passed too quickly, and several corners of her world worth lingering in a while longer, for they show us facets of this remarkable woman that the bare march of events leaves out. Let us turn first to the man who was her great partner in power, and look more closely at the strange alliance that governed a kingdom. Robert Walpole deserves a closer look in his own right, for he was the other half of the partnership that governed Britain through Caroline's queenship, and he was one of the most remarkable politicians his country ever produced, a man as worldly and as shrewd as she herself and her natural ally in the management of power. He was a Norfolk squire by origin, a big, coarse, jovial, hard-drinking countryman with a genius for finance and a deeper genius for the handling of men, who had risen through the rough world of party politics to a dominance over the government so complete and so prolonged that he is generally reckoned the first of those chief ministers whom later ages would call prime ministers. He understood money, he understood patronage, he understood the buying and the managing of votes and loyalties, and above all he understood people, their appetites and their vanities and their fears, and how to work upon them, and he applied this understanding to the building and the keeping of a political ascendancy that lasted some 20 years. He was not a noble or a high-minded figure, this earthy, cynical, immensely capable man, but he was a supremely effective one, and he gave his country 2 decades of peace and stability and growing prosperity, which was no small achievement in that turbulent age. What bound Walpole and she together was a clear-eyed recognition of each other's usefulness and a shared mastery of the realities of power, and the alliance between them was one of the most effective political partnerships in the history of the monarchy. Walpole grasped, with his unsentimental understanding of how things actually worked, that the real key to governing under George II was not the king at all, but the queen, and he cultivated Caroline accordingly, working through her, conferring with her, trusting her to deliver the king's assent to the measures they agreed upon. It was Walpole who made the famous remark that captured the whole arrangement, observing in his blunt country way that he had got the right sow by the ear, by which he meant that he had identified where the true power lay, and had attached himself to it. And the coarse image, for all its lack of gallantry, was an exact description of the political fact. He had seen that she ruled the king, and he had made himself Caroline's partner, and through that partnership he ruled the kingdom. The relationship was not without its tensions and its element of mutual wariness, for these were 2 highly capable and highly self-interested people, each using the other for their own ends, and neither was a fool or a sentimentalist about the alliance. But it held year after year, because it served them both so well, and because beneath the calculation there was a genuine mutual respect, the respect of one first-rate political mind for another. The Queen valued Walpole's ability and his steadiness, and the security his management brought to her family's throne. Walpole valued Caroline's influence over the king and her own shrewd political judgment, which was fully the equal of his own. Together they formed a kind of hidden government, the Queen and the minister conferring and deciding between them, and then the Queen undertaking to bring the king round, and the whole vast business of the state flowing through this private channel of 2 clever people who understood each other. It was an extraordinary thing, and its effectiveness was proved by its results, by the long stability of the reign and the security of the dynasty, And by the way that everything began to come unstuck once death removed the queen from the partnership. There was another figure in the strange domestic drama of Caroline's court who deserves her own moment in the telling, and that is the king's principal mistress, the woman who shared his bed for many years while serving in the queen's own household, for the arrangement between the three of them is one of the odder and more humanly revealing aspects of the whole story. The mistress was a lady of intelligence and charm, well liked by the wits and writers of the day, who held her peculiar position with considerable dignity, and the situation that resulted was a curious one, even by the standards of an age that took royal mistresses for granted. For she was not merely the king's lover, but also one of the ladies who waited upon the queen, attending Caroline in her chamber, performing the intimate services of a royal attendant, so that the wife and the mistress were thrown together daily in the closest domestic proximity, the one serving the other even as they shared the same man. Most wives could not have borne such an arrangement, but Caroline not only bore it, she turned it to her own advantage, and the way she handled it shows her peculiar genius for managing impossible situations. She treated the mistress with cool civility, kept her close where she could be watched and controlled, and declined to give the king the satisfaction of seeing his wife wounded or jealous. And she calculated, correctly, that a mistress kept within the household and within the queen's tolerance was far less of a threat than one driven out to become the centre of a rival interest. There was a kind of weary comedy in the whole business, the king dutifully visiting his mistress at the same hour each evening, with a regularity that suggested habit more than passion, the mistress performing her dual role with patient discretion, and the queen presiding over the arrangement with an amused and tolerant superiority, secure in the knowledge that she, and not the mistress, was the one her husband could not do without. It was not a dignified situation, but Caroline made it serve her, as she made everything serve her, and it left her hold on the king entirely unshaken. To Caroline's many children, and the varied fortunes of the family she raised, we turn next. She bore a large family, some 8 children who lived beyond infancy, and their varied fortunes form a kind of pendant to her own story, the next generation scattering out into the dynastic marriages and the constrained lives that were the lot of royal children in that age. We have heard already of the eldest Frederick, the heir who became her enemy, and there is no need to dwell again on that bitter tale. But the others deserved their moment, for they were her children too, and she loved most of them as fiercely as she came to hate the one. Her eldest daughter, Anne, was a clever and ambitious young woman, very much her mother's child in spirit, who chafed at the narrowness of a princess's prospects and married, to escape them, a foreign prince of no great attractions, becoming a princess of the House of Orange in the Low Countries and playing, in time, her own part in the affairs of that land. She was strong-willed and able, and something of her mother's intelligence ran in her, though her life was lived on a smaller and a more frustrating stage. 2 of the daughters, Amelia and Caroline, never married at all, and lived out their lives as royal spinsters, that peculiar and rather melancholy class of unmarried princesses who hovered about the court with no clear purpose and no real freedom, that their lives shaped by a system that could find no use for them once the marriage market had passed them by. Amelia was spirited and sharp-tongued, and grew eccentric with the years, fond of hunting and cards and her own way. The younger Caroline was gentle and pious and sad, and withdrew increasingly from the world into a private life of devotion and good works. Nursing, it was whispered, a hopeless and unspoken attachment that could never come to anything. They were not unhappy lives, perhaps, but they were unfulfilled ones, the existences of women of intelligence and feeling for whom their world had made no provision, and they cast a quiet light on the limits that hemmed in even the daughters of a king. And again, the son who was closest to Caroline's heart was her second surviving boy, William, who grew up to be a soldier, and who became, in the years after her death, one of the most famous and most controversial military men of his age. He was brave and capable and ambitious, and his mother doted on him, favouring him openly over the hated Frederick and hoping great things for him. And he did indeed win great fame, commanding the king's armies and crushing, some years after Caroline was gone, the last great rising of the exiled royal house that had once held the throne. But his victory was followed by a savagery of repression that earned him a dark and lasting name, and his reputation has come down divided, a hero to some and a byword for cruelty to others. She did not live to see his triumph or his infamy, and perhaps it was as well, for the favourite son in whom she had placed such hopes won a glory that was stained with blood. The two remaining daughters were married off, as princesses were, to German and Scandinavian princes, the one into an unhappy union with a petty German ruler, the other to a king in the north, where she became a queen in her own right, but died young, far from home before her mother had been many years in the grave. It was, taken altogether, a family of mixed and largely melancholy fortunes, marked by the estrangements and the constraints and the early deaths that ran through so many royal families of the age, and she knew her share of grief in it. She had buried children in infancy. She had seen her daughters caught in the narrow destinies their rank imposed. She had been locked in hatred with her eldest son, and she had poured her hopes into a favourite who would win a terrible kind of fame she did not live to witness. The brilliant queen who managed a kingdom so adroitly could not manage the fortunes of her own children, who went out into the world to meet their separate fates as all children do, but beyond the reach of even the cleverest mother's control. It is a reminder that for all her power, Caroline was subject, like everyone, to the common sorrows of family life, and that the woman who ruled Britain through her husband could not rule the hearts or the destinies of her own sons and daughters. We know these things, and we know Caroline herself, with a vividness and an intimacy rare for any figure of that distant age, and we owe that knowledge very largely to one remarkable man who lived at the heart of her court and wrote down what he saw. This was a clever, waspish, observant nobleman, who served the Queen as one of her closest attendants and confidants, a man of sharp wit and sharper pen, devoted to her and admitted to her most private moments, who kept a detailed and unsparing record of the life of the court, its quarrels and its intrigues and its conversations, set down with a novelist's eye and a satirist's malice. His memoirs are one of the richest sources for the inner life of that royal world, and it is through his pages more than any other that we hear Caroline's own voice, catch her wit and her shrewdness and her flashes of feeling, and watch the dramas of her family play out in close and vivid detail. Without him she would be a far more distant and a far less human figure. With him she steps off the page as a living woman, sharp and warm and formidable, and we are able to know her almost as her intimates knew her. He was one ornament of a court that was, for all its German stolidity at the top, a remarkably brilliant place in its literary and intellectual life, for the age of Caroline was a golden age of English letters, and the finest writers and wits of that dazzling generation moved in and around the royal circle. The finest satirists and poets and essayists of the day, some basking in royal favour and some sniping from the opposition, made the London of Caroline's queenship a place of extraordinary literary vitality, and the Queen, with her genuine love of mind and letters, took her pleasure in it and lent it her patronage. Her court was not merely a centre of power, but a centre of wit and culture, a place where the political and the literary worlds met and mingled, and where a clever queen could find, amid all the business of governing, the company of minds worthy of her own. Let us set Caroline's life beside that of the earlier German princess whose story we have followed, the Queen Who Never Was. There is a particular illumination to be had from setting her story beside that of the other German princess, who married into this same royal house a generation before her, the unhappy first wife of George I, the woman who was divorced and imprisoned and who died, after 32 years of captivity, the Queen Who Never Was. The two women make an extraordinary contrast, for they were both clever, both married into the cold and difficult House of Hanover, both confronted with unfaithful husbands and a hard dynastic order that offered women little power and less mercy. And yet the one was destroyed by that world, and the other mastered it. And the difference between their fates is one of the most instructive things in the whole history of the family. The first wife followed her heart, reached for love against the rules, and was crushed without pity. Caroline governed her heart, played the rules with consummate skill, and rose to rule a kingdom. The same order that broke the one raised the other to greatness, and the reason lay in the difference between the two women themselves. For Caroline had learned, whether from observing the fate of her predecessor or from her own clear understanding of the world, the lesson that the earlier princess never grasped or never could bring herself to act upon, which was that a woman in that age won power not by rebellion but by mastery, not by following her own desires but by subordinating them to a long and patient strategy. The first wife had wanted to be loved, and had been destroyed for wanting it. Caroline wanted power and security and the advancement of her family, and she got them by never ever appearing to want anything at all, by perfect self-command, by the endless management of a husband she handled rather than defied. Where the earlier princess had been warm and impulsive and ruled by feeling, Caroline was cool and calculating and ruled by judgment. Where the one had reached for happiness and lost everything, the other had renounced the open pursuit of happiness and gained, in its place, real power and lasting security. It is not a wholly comfortable contrast, for there is something admirable in the first wife's refusal to live without love, and something a little chilling in Caroline's perfect mastery of her own heart. But it is the plain truth of how the two fared, and it shows how narrow was the path that a clever woman had to walk in that age to turn her cleverness into power rather than ruin. And yet we should not draw the contrast too sharply, or make of Caroline a merely cold and calculating creature, for that would be to miss the warmth and the humanity that ran beneath her formidable self-command. She loved her husband, in her clear-eyed way, and loved most of her children, and grieved truly over the losses and estrangements of her family. She had true friendships, real intellectual passions, a deep concern for the good of others, as her championing of inoculation showed. She was not a cold woman who had killed her feelings, but a warm woman who had learned to govern them, to keep them in their place behind a disciplined will, and that is a different and a more admirable thing. The tragedy of her predecessor was that she could not govern her heart. The triumph of Caroline was that she could, without ceasing to have one. And in that difference lies the whole distance between the Queen Who Never Was and the Queen who ruled, the one a victim of the cold machinery of dynastic power, the other its mistress, bending it at last to her own ends. To understand the magnitude of what she achieved, we must also understand the dangerous and unsettled world in which she achieved it, for the Britain over which she helped to rule was no secure and placid kingdom, but a country still uncertain of its new dynasty and threatened by a rival claimant across the water. The Hanoverians were not the only candidates for the British throne. There was another line, the exiled descendants of the old royal house that had been driven out a generation before, the Catholic Stuarts, who maintained their claim from exile abroad and commanded the loyalty of a large body of disaffected subjects at home. The threat of a restoration of that exiled line by foreign invasion or domestic rising hung over the whole of Caroline's time in Britain, a constant background danger that made the security of the Hanoverian throne a thing that could never be taken for granted. Twice in that broad era, The exiled house attempted to reclaim the crown by force, and though the great rising that nearly succeeded came after Caroline's own death, the danger was ever present in her lifetime, and the task of binding the new dynasty firmly into the affections and the institutions of the kingdom, the work to which she gave so much of her effort, was a labour of genuine and urgent importance. For the deepest service that she rendered to her adopted country and her adopted family was precisely this, the steadying and the securing of a dynasty that might easily have failed. The Hanoverians had come to Britain as unloved foreigners, set over a suspicious nation, threatened by a rival claim, ruling through a king who could barely speak the language and made no effort to be liked. It was by no means certain, in those early years, that they would last, that they would put down roots deep enough to weather the storms that lay ahead, and it was she, more than any other single person, who did the patient work of making them last, who charmed the English and learned their ways, who supported the able minister whose management gave the country peace and stability, who governed the difficult king and steadied the whole enterprise through years of danger. By the time she died, the dynasty was secure in a way it had not been when she arrived, rooted and accepted, and able to survive even the great rising that would shortly test it. That was her achievement, and it was a great one, the achievement of a foreign orphan who became the indispensable woman of a kingdom not her own. That larger question of female power in her age is where we go now. Caroline's whole career raises a larger question worth pausing over, the question of female power in her age, for she rose to a real and considerable authority in a world that denied her sex any formal power at all, and the manner of her rise tells us much about the strange and narrow channels through which a clever woman of that time could reach influence. The world Caroline lived in was one in which power belonged, by every law and custom and assumption, to men. They alone could sit in the parliaments, hold the offices of state, command the armies, and fill the high places of government. A woman might reign as queen in her own right, where the accident of succession placed her on a throne. But that was a rare exception, and for the vast majority, even those of the highest rank, formal power was simply out of reach. A queen consort like Caroline had, in the eyes of the law and the constitution, no power whatever. She was the king's wife, an ornament and a vessel for heirs, with no official role in the governing of the realm. And yet Caroline governed, more truly than many a king, and the paradox of her position illuminates the whole situation of able women in that age. Denied power in its open and formal shapes, they could still reach it, if they were clever and determined enough, through its informal and hidden channels, through influence rather than office, through the management of the men who held the formal authority. This was a harder and a more precarious road than the open exercise of power, for it depended entirely on personal skill and personal relationships, on the ability to charm and persuade and manipulate, and it could be lost in a moment if those relationships failed. It left no formal trace and conferred no security, and it required the constant, exhausting labour of indirection. But it was the only road open, and the ablest women of the age learned to travel it with extraordinary skill, building real power out of charm and intelligence, and the patient management of fathers and husbands and sons. She was the supreme example of the type, a woman who turned the very constraints of her position into the instruments of her influence, who made herself indispensable precisely because she could claim nothing openly, and who governed a kingdom from a position that gave her, on paper, no power at all. There is something both admirable and a little melancholy in this spectacle of a great talent, forced to work always in the shadows, never able to act in its own name, always compelled to disguise its power as deference and its strength as submission. The Queen had the gifts to have governed openly and well, the intelligence and judgment and force of character of a first-rate ruler, and she was obliged to spend those gifts on the endless, draining work of managing a husband, of flattering and coaxing and manipulating a man of far smaller capacity than her own, of pretending always to a subordination she did not feel, simply because she was a woman and could rule in no other way. The waste of it, the spectacle of so fine a mind confined to so indirect an exercise of its powers, is part of the larger tragedy of women's position in that age, the systematic stifling and misdirection of half the talent of the human race. That she achieved so much within those constraints is a measure of her genius, that she had to achieve it so deviously that she could never simply rule as her abilities deserved, is a measure of the injustice of her world. To feel the full reality of Caroline's life, we should try to picture the actual world she moved in, the daily texture of the royal and political life of that age, which was very different from our own and stranger than we easily imagine. The court over which she presided was a place of elaborate ceremony and almost no privacy, where the highest ones of the kingdom lived their lives in public, surrounded always by attendants and observers, their every action watched and noted and gossiped over. The day was structured by ritual, by the formal risings and dressings and dinings, by the formal public receptions called drawing rooms, where the king and queen would stand for hours receiving the bows and curtsies of the assembled nobility and gentry, exchanging a few practised words with each, performing the endless ceremonial labour of monarchy. It was a life lived on a stage, exhausting in its formality and its lack of solitude, and she performed it, year after year, with unfailing grace, masking her fatigue and her boredom, and often her physical pain behind the serene public face that her position demanded. Beyond the court lay the brilliant and brawling world of Georgian London, the great city that was then growing into one of the wonders of the age, a place of coffee houses and clubs and theatres, of newspapers and pamphlets and ceaseless political argument, of high culture and low vice jostling in the crowded streets. It was a robust and a turbulent age, coarse and vigorous and intensely alive, an age of great art and deep corruption, of soaring achievement and casual cruelty, and the royal court sat at the apex of it, the source of patronage and honour around which the whole glittering, scheming society revolved. She moved through this world with complete command, understanding its politics and its personalities and its currents of opinion, working its levers of patronage and influence, reading its moods through the newspapers and the gossip of her court. She was a creature of this society and a mistress of it, and to picture her rightly is to picture her at the centre of that vivid, formal, gossiping, ambitious society, the cleverest player in a great game of power and display that filled her days from waking to sleeping. Let us look now at the life of faith and reason that lay beneath the public queen. The age in which she lived was one of the decisive turning points in the history of the human mind, the dawn of what later ages would call the Enlightenment, when the confident new methods of science and reason were being turned, for the first time on such a scale, upon the inherited beliefs of religion and authority and tradition. It was an age of bold questioning, when thinkers dared to examine the foundations of faith and the claims of revelation with a freedom that earlier centuries would have punished as blasphemy, when the very existence and nature of God, the authority of Scripture, the doctrines of the churches, were all thrown open to debate among the educated. And Caroline stood very much in the centre of this ferment, a woman of genuine religious feeling, who was also a child of the new reason, and who refused to keep the two apart, insisting on examining her faith with her intellect rather than holding it by mere inheritance and habit. Her religion, as we have seen, was deep and genuine, deep enough that she had once refused an empire sooner than abandon it, but it was a thinking religion, a faith held with open eyes, examined and questioned and understood, instead of merely obeyed. She delighted in theological argument, in the searching discussion of doctrine and belief, and she surrounded herself with churchmen of a liberal and reasonable caste, men who shared her conviction that faith and reason were friends rather than enemies, that religion could and should be examined in the light of the intellect. She had little patience with narrow bigotry or rigid dogmatism, with the fierce certainties that set believers at one another's throats. Her temper was tolerant and inquiring, more interested in the honest pursuit of truth than in the enforcement of conformity, and she used her considerable influence over the appointments of the Church to favour men of a similarly broad and tolerant spirit. In an age still scarred by the savage religious wars and persecutions of the previous century, this gentle and reasonable faith was a thing of real value, and Caroline's example helped, in its quiet way, to foster a climate of greater tolerance and openness. There was courage in this, as well as intelligence, for to hold one's faith open to question was a riskier and more demanding thing than to hold it shut. Many in that age, frightened by the boldness of the new questioning, retreated into a defensive and rigid orthodoxy, clinging the harder to inherited certainties precisely because they felt them threatened, and many others, following the questioning to its end, abandoned religious belief altogether. She did neither. She kept her faith and kept her reason, holding the two together in a difficult and a fruitful tension, believing and questioning at once, neither surrendering her mind to her creed, nor her creed to her mind. It was the harder path, the path of the thinking believer, who will neither stop thinking nor stop believing, and she walked it with a steadiness that reflected the deep integrity of her character. The woman who had refused to change her religion for a crown was not a woman to hold that religion thoughtlessly. She had earned her faith by examining it, and she went on examining it all her life, and that union of devotion and inquiry was one of the finest things about her. There was a deep division running through Caroline's life that she shared with the whole dynasty she had married into, the division between two countries and two loyalties, for the House of Hanover were rulers of both a great kingdom in Britain and a German electorate across the sea, and they never quite ceased to belong to both. She was wholly German by birth and upbringing, a princess of the old empire, and she came to Britain as a foreigner in middle life, learning its language and its ways as an adult, and yet she gave herself to her adopted country with a completeness that her husband and her father-in-law never matched, throwing in her lot with Britain and making its interests and its affections her own. The king, by contrast, never lost his heart to Britain, longing always for his beloved Hanover, returning to it whenever he could, regarding the electorate as his true home, and the kingdom as a grand but somewhat tiresome inheritance. And the tension between the two countries, between the dynasty's German roots and its British crown, was a constant theme of the reign and a constant source of friction. She navigated this division with her usual shrewdness, understanding the king's attachment to his German lands and accommodating it, taking the reins of the British government during his long absences there, while she remained firmly anchored in the British interest, more British in her sympathies, in the end, than the British-crowned king she served. It was part of her larger achievement, this binding of her to her adopted country, for it helped to make the foreign dynasty less foreign, to give it a face that the English could warm to root it in British soil. She became, in a sense, more committed to Britain than her husband was, the German orphan turned indispensable British queen, and the kingdom was the better for her commitment. The dynasty would carry its double identity, its German and its British selves, for several generations more, and the tension between the two would shape much of the story of the age. But in Caroline it found a figure who, though German to the bone, gave herself wholeheartedly to the British half of its inheritance, and helped thereby to make that inheritance secure. To the question of why so remarkable a woman is so little remembered, we turn next. It is one of the puzzles of the past that a woman so remarkable as Caroline, who governed a great kingdom in all but name, and did it with such skill, should be so little remembered today, her name unknown to most, her achievements forgotten, while far lesser figures are celebrated and recalled. There are reasons for this neglect, and they are worth examining, for they tell us something about how history remembers and forgets, and about whose achievements get recorded and whose are allowed to fade. The first reason is the very nature of the power Caroline wielded, for it was hidden power, exercised in the shadows, disguised always as deference and submission, designed precisely to leave no visible trace. She took the greatest pains never to appear to rule, to let every decision seem her husband's, to mask her influence behind a show of wifely obedience. And she succeeded so completely that the very world she governed scarcely saw her governing it. The power that is exercised invisibly leaves little mark on the formal record, and Caroline's invisibility, so essential to her success in her own day, has cost her her place in the memory of later ages. There is a second reason, and it is the larger pattern of how the achievements of women have been recorded and remembered, or rather not remembered, across the centuries. History, for most of its length, has been written by men and about men, focused on the open and formal exercise of power, on kings and battles, and the public acts of famous men, and it has had little room or scant eye for the kind of influence that women were obliged to exercise, the informal, domestic, behind-the-scenes power that was the only kind open to them. A queen who ruled through her husband, who shaped policy through private persuasion and the management of men, fits awkwardly into a history organized around offices and titles and recorded deeds, and tends to slip through its categories and be lost. Caroline's achievement was real, but it was of a kind that traditional history was poorly equipped to see or to value, and so it faded, while the public deeds of far less able men were carefully recorded and remembered. And there is a third reason, which is simply that Caroline has been overshadowed, crowded out of memory by the louder and more dramatic figures who surrounded her and came after her. Her age was full of vivid and quotable men, of great ministers and famous generals and brilliant writers, and the spectacle of her son's later wars and her grandson's long and troubled reign drew the attention of posterity away from the quiet queen who had steadied the dynasty in its uncertain early years. She did her work and died, and was succeeded by noisier events and noisier people, and the patient, hidden, unglamorous nature of her achievement made it easy to overlook. The very qualities that made her great, the self-effacement, the indirection, the refusal to seek the spotlight, conspired to ensure that the spotlight would not find her in the end, and she passed into the obscurity that her own modesty and her own method had, in a sense, prepared for her. It is worth recovering her, all the same, worth lifting her out of that undeserved obscurity and seeing her clearly, for she is a figure who repays attention richly, and her story corrects and enlarges our picture of her age. She reminds us that real power in history has not always lain where the formal records place it, that behind many a king there stood a cleverer woman doing the actual work of government. She reminds us that intelligence and ability are not the monopoly of those who hold the open offices of power. She reminds us of the human cost and the human ingenuity involved in being a gifted woman in a world that gave women no scope. To remember Caroline is to remember all of this, and to do a kind of justice to one who did great things and was allowed to take little open credit for them. She made herself invisible in order to be effective. We can, at this distance, make her visible again, and give her the recognition that her own age, by the very terms of her success, denied her. The deepest key to Caroline, the thing that explains her formidable character and her unbreakable self-command, lies back at the beginning of her story, in the losses and the dangers of her orphan childhood, for she was forged in grief and insecurity, and they made her what she became. She had lost her father to disease before she could properly know him, watched her mother's wretched second marriage and learned at first hand what a loveless union could do to a woman, lost her mother, and been left an orphan and a near stranger in an indifferent household, and known from her earliest years what it was to have no security and no certain place in the world. A childhood like that can break a person, or it can harden them into strength, and in Caroline it did the latter, teaching her self-reliance, self-command, and a clear-eyed understanding of how the world really worked that never left her. From those early sorrows came the qualities that defined her, the iron control over her own feelings, the refusal ever to depend helplessly on the goodwill of others, the determination to secure herself by her own intelligence and effort rather than to trust to fortune or affection. She had seen, in her mother's fate, what happened to a woman who was at the mercy of a husband who did not care for her, and she resolved that she would never be so helpless, that she would make herself indispensable, would build a power that did not depend on being loved. She had known loss and insecurity too early and too deeply to be careless of security ever again, and she spent her life building the safety she had lacked as a child, the safety of indispensability, of being the one her husband could not do without, of holding real power in a world that might otherwise have discarded her as it had so nearly discarded the orphaned girl from Ansbach. The wounds of her childhood became the sources of her strength, and the frightened orphan grew into the formidable queen precisely because she had learned so young and so hard that she could rely on nothing and no one but herself. We come now to what her remarkable life might finally say to us. We should not imagine that Caroline was universally admired in her own day, or that her remarkable qualities won her the love of all her subjects, for she had her critics and her enemies, and the gap between her real worth and her contemporary reputation is itself a part of her story. She lived in an age of fierce and unbridled political satire, when the opposition press and the wits of the day attacked the court and the ministry with a savagery and a freedom that would astonish a later age, and the Queen, as a central figure of that government, came in for her full share of abuse. She was mocked and caricatured in the pamphlets and the verses of her enemies, her influence over the king held up to ridicule, and her management of affairs portrayed as the meddling of a domineering wife, her German origins thrown in her face by those who resented the foreign dynasty. The very power that was her achievement made her a target, for those who opposed the government she helped to direct could hardly attack her openly as a ruler, since she held no office, and so they attacked her as a wife who had overstepped her place, a woman governing where she had no business to govern. There was, in much of this hostility, the particular venom that a clever and powerful woman has always tended to attract, the resentment of those who find a woman's exercise of influence somehow unnatural and offensive in a way that a man's never is. She governed, and the fact of a woman governing even from behind the throne grated on many who would have thought nothing of the same power in a male minister. She was accused of ruling her husband, as though that were a peculiar scandal rather than, as it was, a considerable public service. She was blamed for the unpopular measures of the day, and given little credit for its successes. She was, in short, judged by the harsh and unequal standard that her age, and many later ages, applied to women who reached beyond the narrow sphere allotted to them. The injustice of it is plain enough to us now, but it was real and wounding in her own day, and Caroline bore it as she bore everything, with composure and without complaint, never letting the abuse provoke her into any response that might have damaged her position. Yet she was not without her admirers and her defenders, and among those who knew her or understood what she was doing, her reputation stood high. The great minds of the age who came into contact with her, the philosophers and the writers and the men of science, recognized her quality and prized it, The politicians who worked with her respected her judgment and her skill, and the ordinary people, who knew little of the hidden machinery of government, warmed to her over the years as the gracious and accessible face of a dynasty that her father-in-law had done so much to make disliked. Her championing of inoculation, in particular, won her a genuine popular gratitude, for it touched the lives of ordinary families in the most direct and personal way. So her reputation in her own day was a divided thing, abused by her political enemies and the resenters of female power, honoured by those who understood her worth, warmly regarded by much of the public. And it is only at the distance of centuries that we can weigh these conflicting verdicts and arrive at a juster estimate of what she truly was. Among the brighter threads of Caroline's life was her patronage of the arts, and especially of music, for she was a genuine lover of the arts and a generous supporter of them, and her court was a centre of artistic as well as intellectual life. The greatest musical genius of the age, the composer who had settled in England and made it his home, enjoyed the warm favour of Caroline and her husband, and he repaid it with some of the most magnificent music ever written for an English monarchy. He had composed the soaring anthems for their coronation, music of such splendour that one of them has been used at every coronation since, and he would compose, in the end, the grave and beautiful anthem that mourned Caroline at her funeral. The bond between the royal couple and the great composer was a real one, founded on genuine admiration, and it gave the reign a musical glory that still echoes down the centuries, a reminder that this court of political intrigue was also a place where fine art was made and cherished. There was a curious way in which even the arts became entangled in the bitter family quarrel that ran through Caroline's later years, for the rivalry between the royal couple and their hated son extended even into the world of music and the opera. The king and queen supported the great composer and his company. Their son, in his ceaseless opposition to his parents, threw his support behind a rival opera company set up in competition, so that the musical life of the capital divided into warring camps that mirrored the division within the royal family. It is a strange and a telling detail, this spilling of the family's hatreds into the opera house, and it shows how completely the quarrel with Frederick poisoned every corner of their lives, turning even the patronage of art into another field of battle. But for Caroline, beneath all the rivalry and the politics, the love of music and of art was real and deep, a genuine pleasure and a genuine value, part of that larger love of the fine things of the mind and the spirit that ran through her whole character. The cultivated orphan who had grown up in the salon of a philosopher queen never lost her delight in beauty and learning, and she brought that delight to the throne and made it for a while part of the life of a kingdom. It is to the price that Caroline paid for all her greatness, the hidden cost of her long mastery, that we come now. For all her success, we should not forget the price that Caroline paid for it, the hidden cost of a life spent in perpetual self-command and unceasing management, for it was a heavy one, and it weighed on her in ways that the watching world seldom saw. To govern, as she governed, by indirection and disguise, to hold real power while pretending always to have none, to manage a difficult and demanding husband day after day, year after year, flattering and coaxing and steering him while never letting him feel steered, was labour of an exhausting and a draining kind, a constant performance that could never be relaxed. She could never simply be herself, never act openly in her own name, never set down the mask of deference and submission that her power required her to wear. She had to be always calculating, always controlled, always watching her words and her face, lest a moment's frankness should wound her husband's pride and undo the work of years. It was a kind of perpetual acting, and the strain of it, sustained across decades, must have been immense. There was a loneliness in it too. the particular loneliness of those who hold great power in secret and can share the truth of their position with almost no one. She could not openly acknowledge what she did. She could not take credit for her achievements or comfort in her successes. She had to watch lesser people take the honor for work that was hers and smile and say nothing. The very completeness of her disguise cut her off from any open recognition of her true self and her true role, and she lived, in a sense, behind a permanent veil, known to the world as the king's dutiful wife while being, in fact, the kingdom's hidden ruler. Only a very few intimates ever saw the real Caroline, the formidable intelligence behind the deferential mask, and even with them she had to be careful. For the rest, she played her part, alone with the knowledge of what she truly was and what she truly did. It is a lonely thing to be so much more than one is allowed to seem. And there was the physical price as well, the toll that the strain and the labour and the endless childbearing took on her body, culminating in the hidden injury that she carried so long in silence, and that killed her in the end. She drove herself hard in the service of her family and her adopted kingdom, denying herself rest and ease, hiding her ailments, pushing through pain and fatigue to keep up the ceaseless work of management and ceremony, and her body, in the end, paid for it, broken by the childbearing and worn by the strain, and finally destroyed by the affliction she was too proud to acknowledge until it was too late. There is a real pathos in the spectacle of this woman who managed everything so well and yet managed herself in this one fatal respect so poorly, who could secure a dynasty but could not seek help for her own failing body until it had carried her past saving. The price of her greatness in the end was her life, and she paid it as she had paid all the other prices of her remarkable career, without complaint and without flinching, to the very end. It is worth standing back, as we near the end of her story, to consider what Caroline's reign meant for the larger shape of the monarchy and the kingdom, for she lived at an important moment in the long transformation of British government, and she played her part in it. The age she lived in was one in which the real power of the crown was quietly ebbing away from the monarch and toward the ministers and the parliament, in which the king was ceasing to be the active ruler of earlier ages and becoming, by slow degrees, the more limited and ceremonial figure that the monarchy would eventually become. The great minister who dominated affairs, governing through the management of parliament and the control of patronage, was a sign of this great change, the rise of a kind of government that rested on the management of the legislature rather than on the personal will of the king, and Caroline's whole career was bound up with this transformation, for in a curious way, Caroline's hidden rule both reflected and advanced this larger shift, for the very fact that real direction of affairs lay with the Queen and the minister rather than with the king himself, was a sign of how far the personal power of the monarch had already receded. The king reigned and blustered and imagined himself the master, but the actual work of ruling was done by others, by the able minister and the clever queen working together, and the king's role was increasingly to give his assent to policies shaped without him. This was not yet the fully developed system of later times, in which the monarch would reign without ruling at all, and the ministers would govern in the monarch's name. But it was a long step in that direction, and Caroline's reign, with its hidden government by queen and minister, was part of the slow evolution by which the crown's personal power was transferred to those who could command the parliament. She helped, without ever intending it as such, to shape the constitutional habits of her adopted country, to accustom it to government by ministers rather than by the personal will of the king, and in this too her quiet influence ran deeper than the formal record shows, to the final meaning of her life, and the things it can still say to us across the centuries, we turn next. If we lift our eyes from the details of Caroline's life and look at the long sweep of history that flowed from it, we can see more clearly than her contemporaries could just how much her quiet work mattered For the dynasty she helped to steady through its uncertain early years went on to a momentous future. The throne she did so much to make secure was never, after her day, seriously shaken. The line she helped to plant put down deep roots and endured, passing through her grandson and his descendants, generation after generation, down through the centuries to the royal house that reigns in Britain to this very day. What had been, when she arrived, a precarious and unloved novelty became, in the fullness of time, one of the most settled and lasting monarchies in the world, and a fair share of the credit for that endurance belongs to the patient, hidden labours of its cleverest early queen. She did not live to see the dynasty's later triumph, and could not have foreseen it, but she had done as much as any single person to make it possible, and the steadiness she gave it in its first uncertain decades was the soil from which all the rest grew. And the kingdom whose stability she had helped to secure went on, in the generations after her, to a greatness that she could scarcely have imagined. The peace and the stability that the long ministry she supported had given the country laid the foundations for an extraordinary expansion of British wealth and power. In the decades after her death, the kingdom would rise to become the greatest commercial and naval power in the world, would win and lose and win again vast empires across the globe, would lead the world into a transformation of industry and society that would remake the entire human condition. The Queen did not live to see any of this, and she could not have foreseen it. But the patient work she did, the steadying of the dynasty, and the support of the stable government that made such growth possible, was part of the soil from which that future grew. The hidden queen who governed so quietly in the early decades of the century helped, in her unobtrusive way, to set her adopted country on the path to the greatness it would later achieve. There is something fitting in the thought that so much should have flowed from the quiet labours of a woman who took such care never to be seen, that the foreign orphan who made herself indispensable should have helped to shape the future of a great nation and a great dynasty without ever appearing to do anything at all. It is the final irony of her self-effacing greatness that her invisible work had such visible and lasting consequences, that the patient management and the hidden influence of a single clever woman should ripple out across the centuries in ways she never sought and never saw. She built no monuments to herself, claimed no credit, sought no fame. She simply did the work that needed doing, steadily and well, and let the results speak, in time, for themselves. And the results, when we trace them out across the long perspective of history, are large indeed, larger than those of many a famous king whose name is far better remembered than hers. Let us see her once more, before we take our leave of her, not as a name in a history or a figure in an argument, but as the living woman she was, at the height of her powers, in the fullness of her strange and remarkable life. Imagine her in the grand rooms of one of her palaces, on an ordinary evening of her queenship, moving through the crowded ceremony of the court with that unfailing grace, exchanging her practised words with the bowing nobles and the curtsying ladies, her quick eyes taking in everything, her quick mind reading the moods and the currents of the room, even as she performs the tireless labour of monarchy. See the proud, blustering king beside her, leaning on her without knowing how completely he leans, deferred to by a wife who governs him through her deference. See the shrewd minister in the corner, catching the Queen's eye, the two of them understanding each other across the room without a word. See, beneath the serene and gracious public face, the formidable intelligence at work, weighing, calculating, managing, the cleverest person in the kingdom, hiding her cleverness behind a mask of wifely duty. And then imagine her later, when the ceremony is done and the court has dispersed in the quiet of her own apartments, turning at last to the things she truly loved, to her books and her letters, to the philosophy and the theology that fed her mind, to the correspondence with great thinkers that linked her to the world of ideas she had never left behind. See her reading late into the night, the orphan from Ansbach who had refused an empire, the protégé of a philosopher queen, the patron of inoculation and the friend of Leibniz, alone with her thoughts and her books in the brief hours that were her own. There is the whole of her in that double image, the public queen performing her endless part and the private mind pursuing its real loves, the hidden ruler and the genuine thinker, the woman who managed a kingdom by day and read philosophy by night. That is the Caroline worth remembering, formidable and cultivated and humane, a great intelligence making the most of itself in the most constrained of circumstances, and finding, in the narrow space the world allowed her, room for a kind of greatness. We come at last to what her remarkable life can finally say to us across all the centuries between. If we look for the single thread that runs through the whole of Caroline's life and binds its many parts together, we find it, I think, in that early and defining act by which she first stepped onto the stage of history, her refusal of an empire for the sake of her conscience. That choice made when she was scarcely more than a girl was not an isolated moment, but the first clear showing of a quality that would mark her entire life, an integrity, a strength of inner principle, a refusal to be governed by mere advantage that lay at the very core of her character. She would not change her faith for a crown because the faith was true to her and the crown was not worth a lie, and that same firmness of inner conviction, that same refusal to be merely expedient, can be traced through everything that followed. Beneath all the calculation and the management and the worldly skill that her later career required. For it would be a mistake to see Caroline as merely a clever manipulator, a woman of pure calculation with no firm principle beneath the strategy, and the thread of conscience that began with her great refusal corrects that picture. She was indeed a consummate manager of men and affairs, supple and patient and endlessly indirect. But the suppleness served ends that were in their way principled, the security of her family, the good of her adopted country, the advancement of knowledge and the relief of suffering, as her championing of inoculation showed. She bent and flattered and dissembled in the means, because the world gave her no other means, but in the ends she pursued, there was a steadiness and an integrity that went back to the girl who had refused the empire. She knew what she valued, and she held to it through a lifetime of compromise in the methods, and that combination of flexible means and steady ends is perhaps the truest mark of her particular kind of wisdom. There is a lesson in that combination, if we care to draw one, about the relation of principle and practicality in a difficult age. She lived in circumstances that allowed her no clean or open exercise of her gifts, that forced her into indirection and disguise and the endless management of a man and a court, and she might have concluded, as cynics in every age conclude, that in such a world principle is a luxury and only advantage matters. She drew the opposite conclusion. She held to her inner convictions, to her faith and her loyalties, and her concern for the good, while bending every practical art to their service. She was principled in her ends and supple in her means, and she neither sacrificed her integrity to her effectiveness, nor her effectiveness to her integrity, but found a way to keep both. It is not an easy balance to strike, and few in any age strike it as well as she did, but it is the balance that her whole life recommends, the marriage of a steady conscience with a practical wisdom, of knowing what one values and finding a way in a hard world to serve it. And so we come to the end of her story, and to the question of what this long-dead queen, this orphan who became the hidden ruler of a kingdom, can still say to us across the wide gulf of years that divides her world from ours. Much has changed since her day, and the particular constraints that shaped her life, the denial of open power to women, the dynastic marriages, the whole vanished apparatus of her age, have largely passed away. And yet there is much in her story that speaks to us still, that reaches across the centuries and touches the permanent things of the human condition. She speaks to us, first, of resilience, of the capacity of the human spirit to be forged, rather than broken by early grief and loss, to take the wounds of a hard beginning and turn them into sources of strength. For the frightened orphan who had lost everything became, through that very loss, the formidable woman who could lose nothing again. She speaks to us, too, of the worth of intelligence and cultivation, of the life of the mind held fast through every distraction and constraint. She never let the demands of power or the limits of her position kill the love of learning that was the truest part of her, and she found, even on a throne and amid all the labour of governing, room for philosophy and friendship and the things of the spirit. And she speaks to us, perhaps most of all, of the dignity of work that goes unrecognised, of the good that is done in this world by people who never receive the credit for it, who labour in the shadows and let others take the honour, and who must find their reward in the work itself and in the knowledge of what they have achieved. She achieved much, and was allowed to seem to do nothing. She ruled a kingdom, and was remembered, if at all, as a king's wife. And there is a quiet heroism in that acceptance of unrecognised achievement that has its own deep value, and its own lesson for an age as hungry for recognition as our own. Yet before we take our final leave of her, there are a few last scenes worth pausing on, moments and corners of her world that the long march of reflection has left aside, and they will repay a little lingering. Let us turn first to the day she was crowned. The day of her crowning, in the autumn of 1727, was one of the grandest public spectacles of the age, and it is worth picturing for a moment in its full splendour, for it was the outward show of the power she had reached. The ancient Abbey of the Kings was hung with rich cloth and filled with the assembled greatness of the kingdom. The peers in their robes and coronets, the bishops in their vestments, the high officers of state bearing the regalia, the whole gorgeous apparatus of a coronation, unfolding in slow and solemn ceremony. The Queen was robed and anointed, and crowned with all the ancient rites. A German orphan made the consecrated queen of a great nation, and she is said to have worn upon her person a fortune in jewels, so many that she could not provide them all herself, and borrowed and hired what she lacked, glittering from head to foot in the borrowed splendour of her new estate. It was the visible summit of her long ascent, the frost-bound child of Ansbach, standing crowned beneath the abbey vaults, and through it all rang the magnificent music that the great composer had written for the occasion, music of such soaring grandeur that one of those anthems has been sung at every crowning of a British monarch from that day to this. There is something fitting in the thought that the splendour of that day was, like so much of Caroline's life, partly a thing of borrowed and assembled show, the jewels hired, the grandeur put on for the occasion, the real woman standing quiet and watchful beneath the glittering display. For she was never deceived by the pomp of her position, never mistook the show of power for its substance. She knew that the crown and the jewels and the ceremony were the outward trappings, and that the real power lay elsewhere, in the patient hidden work of management and influence that no ceremony could confer. She wore the borrowed jewels gracefully, and played her part in the great spectacle, and then she went back to the real business of governing, which was done not in the abbey, but in the private chamber, not with regalia, but with intelligence and patience, and the endless management of a difficult man. The coronation was the picture of her power. The reality of it was something quieter and far more remarkable. We should pause, too, over the world of science and discovery that her court touched, for Caroline lived at one of the supreme moments in the history of human understanding, and she stood close to its very centre. The age she came into was the age in which the modern understanding of the physical universe was being born, in which a towering English genius had worked out the laws that governed the motion of the planets and the fall of an apple alike, binding the heavens and the earth together under a single majestic system of natural law. That great man was still living when Caroline came to Britain, the most famous natural philosopher in the world, the president of the kingdom's foremost society of learned men, and she counted it among the privileges of her position to honour him, and the bold company of inquirers gathered about him. She had a real and an informed curiosity about their work, reading and questioning and following the advance of the new knowledge with a delight that few crowned heads have ever brought to such matters, and she made of her court a place where natural philosophy was prized and its practitioners welcomed. To stand so close to the birth of the modern understanding of nature, and to grasp something of its meaning, was given to few in that age, and to almost no other queen. She honoured the men of science as few monarchs ever have, seeking out their company, following their findings, and lending her countenance to their labours at a time when the new natural philosophy was still regarded by many with suspicion. It was a striking thing. This queen who cared more for thinkers than for courtiers, who prized discovery above display and reason above show, and who followed the hard debates of natural philosophy with a real and an informed understanding, and it placed her among the most genuinely enlightened rulers of an age that prided itself on enlightenment. The new science was remaking the human picture of the world in her lifetime, and Caroline was not a mere spectator of that transformation, but a knowing and a sympathetic participant in it, a friend and patron of the men who were pushing back the boundaries of what could be known. It is one more facet of her remarkable mind, and one more reason to lift her out of the obscurity into which she has too long been allowed to fall. And there is one last great event that belongs to her story, though it came some years after her death, for it was the final flowering of two things that ran through her life: the long danger of the rival royal house, and the dark destiny of her favourite son. Some 8 years after Caroline died, the exiled royal line made its last and most dangerous attempt to reclaim the throne she had helped to secure, when a young and romantic prince of that house landed in the north, raised the clans to his banner, and marched a rebel army deep into the heart of the kingdom, throwing the whole country into alarm and coming nearer to success than anyone had thought possible. It was the supreme crisis that the Hanoverian dynasty had always feared, the rival claim made good by the sword, and for a time the throne itself seemed to tremble. And it was Caroline's favourite son, the soldier in whom she had placed such hopes, who was sent to meet the threat, and who broke the rebel army at last in a single bloody battle on a bleak northern moor, ending forever the hopes of the exiled house. But the victory was followed by a savagery of repression that stained the victor's name forever, a harrying of the defeated country so merciless that it earned him a grim and lasting byword for cruelty, and the favourite son of the philosopher queen passed into history as a kind of butcher. There is a dark irony in it that Caroline did not live to see, that the boy she had loved above all her children, in whom she had invested such tender hopes, should have won his great fame by a slaughter that blackened his name down the centuries, and one wonders what she, with her humane and enlightened spirit, her championing of the relief of human suffering, would have made of the cruelty that her favourite worked in her dynasty's name. She was spared the knowledge of it, dying before the rising and the repression alike, and perhaps it was a mercy. But the episode completed two of the great themes of her life, securing forever against the rival house the throne she had laboured to make safe, and revealing the dark side of the soldier son she had cherished. And so it belongs, however grimly, to the full telling of her story. And what of the woman herself, the living person behind all these public acts and political calculations? For it is easy, in tracing a great career to lose sight of the human being who lived it. Those who knew Caroline have left us a vivid enough picture, and it is worth gathering it together that we may see her not merely as a historical figure, but as a person we might almost have met. In her youth she was, by every account, a real beauty, fair-haired and fine-skinned and shapely, with a warmth and a brightness of manner that drew people to her irresistibly. And though the years and the many childbirths thickened her figure and dimmed the first bloom as they do, she kept to the end a presence and a dignity and a charm that age could not take from her. She was a handsome and a commanding woman, in short, who looked the part of a queen, and who carried her queenship with a natural grace that the cold and awkward men of her family conspicuously lacked. But it was her mind and her manner, far more than her looks, that struck those who came to know her, for she was one of the most delightful talkers of her age, quick and witty and endlessly engaging, able to discourse with philosophers on philosophy, and with politicians on politics, and with poets on poetry, and to hold her own in any company in the kingdom. Her conversation sparkled with intelligence and a dry, sometimes sharp, sometimes wicked humour, and those who were admitted to her private circle counted it among the rare pleasures of their lives. She could be tender with her friends and devastating with her enemies, and her tongue, when she chose to loose it, could be very sharp indeed, as her unhappy eldest son discovered. Beneath the charm there was steel, the iron self-command that governed her whole life, and a will as strong as any in the kingdom. She was no soft or yielding woman, but a creature of formidable force and keen intelligence, who happened also to possess deep warmth and abundant charm. She had her appetites and her weaknesses, like everyone, and they make her the more human and the more real to us. She relished good food and good company, and grew stout in their enjoyment. She delighted in talk, and could talk for hours. She loved the things of the mind with a passion that never cooled. She had a temper, which she controlled with the same iron discipline she applied to everything, rarely letting it show, swallowing her anger and her hurt behind the serene public face that her position demanded, so that the perpetual mastery of her own strong feelings was one of the chief labours of her life. She was physically brave, as her bearing of the smallpox and the dreadful surgery of her last illness showed. She was loyal to those she loved. She was capable of real tenderness and real ruthlessness, of deep affection and bitter hatred, of high principle and supple calculation, all held together in one formidable and fascinating character. She was, in a word, far more than the dutiful consort that careless history made of her, a vivid, forceful, brilliant, complicated woman, fully alive and fully human, and to recover the truth of her is to meet one of the most remarkable personalities of her age. It is this human reality in the end that makes her worth our long attention, for she was not a marble figure of history, but a living woman who loved and grieved and schemed and suffered and triumphed, who carried the wounds of a hard childhood and the burdens of a constrained life, and made, out of difficult materials, something rare and fine. We have spent these hours in her company, and we have come to know her a little, the orphan and the queen, the philosopher and the schemer, the tender mother and the bitter enemy, the women who ruled a kingdom in secret and asked for nothing in return. And she is, I hope, more real to us now than she was when we began, a presence rather than a name, a person we have travelled alongside through the long unfolding of her remarkable life. That perhaps is the truest thing that these quiet journeys into the past can do, to make the long dead live again for a little while, to let us keep company with a vanished soul, and to find in the contemplation of another human life something that speaks to our own. There is one more thing worth reflecting on as we near the end, and that is the strange part that chance and accident played in lifting Caroline to the heights she reached, for her astonishing rise depended, at every turn, on a long chain of fortunate accidents that might so easily have fallen out otherwise. Consider how many things had to happen, each unlikely in itself, for the orphan of Ansbach to become the Queen of Britain. The British throne had to fall by the failure of an entire royal line to leave an heir upon the distant German family she married into. The old electress who was named heiress had to die just weeks too soon to inherit, passing the crown to her son, and so to Caroline's husband. The young prince had to choose Caroline of all the brides available to him, and to choose her for love rather than mere policy. And 100 other turns of fortune, large and small, had to align to carry the portionless orphan from her frost-bound German town to the throne of a great kingdom. Change any one of them, and her whole story dissolves into a different and a lesser life. And yet it would be quite wrong to credit her greatness to mere luck, for fortune only opened the doors. It was Caroline herself who walked through them and made of the opportunity what she made. Many a princess was carried by chance to a throne and did nothing with it, remaining a mere ornament, a cipher, a name in the records, and nothing more. The opportunity that fortune gave to Caroline, it gave to others who wasted it utterly. What Caroline did with her chances was the work not of luck but of character, of the intelligence and the will and the long discipline that she brought to bear on every opening that fortune offered her. Luck made her a queen. She made herself a ruler. Luck set her near the levers of power. Her own genius taught her to work them. The accidents of fortune are the same for many. What distinguishes the great from the forgotten is what they make of those accidents, and Caroline made of hers about as much as any human being could. There is a kind of wisdom in holding both halves of this truth together, the large part that chance plays in every life, and the decisive part that is played by what we do with what chance sends us. Caroline's life is a study in both, an existence that could not have happened without a long run of lucky accidents, and that would have come to nothing despite them all, without the extraordinary qualities she brought to the using of them. She was fortune's child, and her own creation at once, lifted by chance and made by character, and the two together produced one of the most remarkable careers of her age. It is a thing to ponder gently as sleep draws near, the strange interplay of accident and will that shapes a human course, and the quiet truth that fortune may open the door, but it is character that must walk through it, as Caroline walked through hers, all the way from a small German court to a place among the great queens of history. The world that Caroline left behind was a poorer and a greyer place for her absence, and nowhere was this felt more keenly than in the long final chapter of her husband's life, for the king outlived her by more than 2 decades, and those were lonely and diminished years. George II had been, for all his blustering independence, utterly dependent on his wife, and when she was gone he was like a man who has lost the better part of himself, bereft of the counsel, and the comfort, and the steadying presence that had ordered his whole existence. He grew old slowly and stubbornly, a brave and limited man going through the motions of a reign that had lost its guiding intelligence, fighting his wars and quarrelling with his ministers and feuding still, even after her death, with the son they had both detested. He took, in his later years, to a kind of melancholy routine, and there were those who said that he spoke of Caroline constantly, that her memory ruled his solitary old age as her living presence had ruled his prime, and that he never ceased to feel the wide gap her death had torn in his life. He kept his word about the marriage, as we have seen, never taking another wife, faithful in widowhood to the queen he had so often betrayed while she lived, and there is something both absurd and genuinely moving in that fidelity. The unfaithful husband become the constant widower, mourning to the end of his long life the one woman he had never been able to do without. The reign ground on through its later decades, marked by the long war that won the kingdom and empire and the great rising that was crushed by Caroline's favourite son, all of it unfolding without the queen who had steadied the dynasty's early years, the king, growing ever older and ever more solitary, at the centre of events he could no longer fully master. And when at last he died, full of years, an old and lonely man, his final instructions were carried out, and the sides of the two coffins were drawn away, and the king was laid down beside his queen, and the long separation of their deaths was ended as he had wished. The two of them mingled together at the last beneath the stones of the great abbey. It was in its strange way a fitting end to one of the most peculiar and most genuine of royal marriages, the union of the clever woman and the limited man, founded in a youthful love match, strained by infidelity and tested by every kind of difficulty, and yet enduring, in its odd fashion, to the very end and beyond it, into the shared rest of the grave. He had loved her clumsily, and betrayed her casually, and depended on her utterly, and she had managed him, and forgiven him, and ruled through him, and beneath all the strangeness there had been something real between them, a partnership and an affection that survived everything the world could throw at it. And so they lie together still, the king and the queen who never quite let him see how completely she governed him, joined in death as they had been joined in that long and complicated life. And the visitor to that ancient abbey may stand. They know where to look above the mingled dust of one of history's stranger and more enduring marriages. As for the verdict of history on Caroline herself, it has been slow and uncertain, and is only now beginning to do her justice, for she fell, after her death, into the obscurity that her own self-effacing methods had prepared for her, and she has had to wait a long time for her rediscovery. For generations she was a mere footnote in the histories, the wife of a not very interesting king, mentioned in passing, if at all, her real achievements unrecognised and her real character unknown. The historians, focused on the open and formal exercise of power, on the kings and the ministers and the public deeds of famous men, simply did not see her, or saw only the dutiful consort and missed the hidden ruler behind her. The very completeness of her disguise, so essential to her power in her own day, had deceived posterity as thoroughly as it had deceived her contemporaries, and she passed down through the generations unremembered, one more able woman lost to a history that had no eye for her kind of greatness. But in more recent times the picture has begun to change, as historians have learned to look beyond the formal record and to see the hidden workings of power, to value the informal influence that women were obliged to exercise, to read the memoirs and the letters that preserve the private truth behind the public show. And as they have looked again, Caroline has begun to emerge from the shadows, to be seen at last for what she was, one of the ablest and most remarkable women ever to stand near a throne, a hidden ruler of real genius, a philosopher queen, a pioneer of public health, a figure who deserves a far larger place in memory than she has been given. The rediscovery is still going on, and her name is still far less known than it should be, but the work of justice has begun, and the orphan from Ansbach, who governed a kingdom in secret, is slowly, at last, being given her due. She made herself invisible, and the centuries are learning, slowly, to see her again, and to honour the great and quiet thing she did with her improbable and remarkable life. And now, as the hour grows late and sleep draws near, it is time to take our leave of her, gently, and to bring our long evening together to its close. Let us trace, one last time, gently and without hurry, the long road that this remarkable woman travelled, for the sheer span of it is a wonder to rest the mind upon as sleep comes near. She began in a small frost-bound town in the heart of Germany, a younger daughter of a minor prince, born into modest obscurity and marked early for grief, and she ended beneath the stones of the greatest abbey of a great kingdom, a queen mourned by a nation, her dust mingled with a king's. Between those 2 points lay a journey of astonishing distance, not merely across the map of Europe, from Ansbach to Berlin to Hanover to London, but across the whole range of human fortune, from orphaned helplessness to the summit of power, from a child who had lost everything to a woman who held a kingdom in her hand. Few lives travel so far, and fewer still travel it by the strength of their own intelligence and character, against so many obstacles and through so many sorrows, as Caroline travelled hers. Think of the girl in the cold court of her childhood, fatherless and then motherless, an unwanted orphan in an indifferent household with no fortune and no prospects and no certain place in the world, and think of the woman she became, the philosopher queen who corresponded with the greatest minds of her age, who governed a kingdom through a husband she managed with consummate art, who braved a deadly disease to protect her children and her people, who was honoured by Voltaire and mourned by a nation. The distance between the two is the measure of what she made of herself, of the strength she drew from her own grief and the power she built from her own intelligence, and it is a distance that ought to inspire wonder and a kind of quiet admiration in anyone who hears her story. She was given little and made much. She was denied power and seized it. She was dealt sorrow and turned it into strength. And she did it all with a grace and a self-command that never faltered, from the frightened orphan to the dying queen. And in the end, when the long journey was done, and the hidden ruler laid down her power at last, there was a kind of peace in it, the peace of a life fully lived and fully spent, a great task accomplished and a great distance travelled. She had done what she set out to do, secured her family and steadied a dynasty, and served her adopted country well. She had kept her faith and her integrity through a lifetime of compromise. She had loved and been loved in the strange, imperfect way that life allowed her, and she had filled her years with more of achievement and interest than a dozen ordinary lives could hold. She died in pain, but she died unbroken, her courage and her wit intact to the very last, and she was carried to her rest amid the grief of those who knew her worth. It was a good ending to a great life, and there is a deep contentment to be found in the contemplation of it, the contentment of seeing a difficult and an extraordinary journey brought safely and honourably to its close. So let her rest now, that the orphan from Ansbach who became the hidden queen of a kingdom, the philosopher on the throne, the woman who ruled in all but name and asked for no credit, and was almost forgotten, and is slowly being remembered again. Let her rest beneath the abbey stones, mingled with the king who could not do without her, her labours over and her long journey done. And let her story settle gently in your mind as you drift toward sleep, the tale of a fine intelligence and a fine spirit, making the most of a hard and narrow world, finding room for a kind of greatness in the small space that was allowed her, and travelling, by her own strength and wit, the whole long road from a frost-bound German town to the heart of a great kingdom, and a place, however quiet, in the memory of the world. It is a tale to rest easy with, a story of strength and survival, and the quiet triumph of a remarkable mind, and it has been a privilege to travel it with you through these last few hours. Our long evening together has nearly reached its end now, and there is nothing left for you to do but let go of the day entirely and sink down into the rest you have earned. We have travelled a great distance tonight, from a small German court to the throne of a kingdom, through grief and danger and triumph and loss, in the company of one of the most remarkable women who ever lived. And now the journey is done, and the night is yours, and sleep is close at hand. Let the cares of the day be wholly gone. Let the warmth gather round you, and let the gentle weight of all these old and human stories carry you down into a deep and a peaceful rest. Before I go, there is one last small thing, offered as softly as everything else this evening. If the hours we have spent together tonight have brought you some comfort, And if these quiet journeys into the past are something you would like to find again on the nights when sleep is slow in coming, then you would be most welcome to stay a while in this gentle company, so that another of these long evenings can find its way to you when next you need it. There is never any hurry about it, and no need to do a thing tonight, but rest. The invitation is simply there, waiting quietly for whenever you should want it. For now, though, let all of that go and let yourself drift, knowing that the day is done and you have nothing left to carry. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.